Chapter 31, Return to Winterfell 2. Happiness is a simple word, but many seek it as a goal in life, but as a man grows older, happiness often comes from family. Enar Targaryen. You greedy little dragon. Jon watched the small silver and purple dragon with a helpless look. Dragons liked sheep meat, but where could he get a sheep where he was? Jon would have to hunt to feed this greedy little dragon that loved food more than anything. But when the little creature ate 3 rabbits and looked at him with innocent golden eyes, the true prince of Westeros sighed helplessly. Picking up his bow and dagger, Jon ventured out once more in search of food, thinking of giving the little dragon to Caraxes to take care of. Responsibility? All males in the wild left their young with their mothers. He was doing what nature demanded. As for what Caraxes would think after hearing his thoughts, Jon didn't care. He would be far away not to talk to an adult dragon full of rage. An hour later, Jon watched as the small dragon tossed the 4th rabbit into the air with its mouth, releasing a small stream of silver flames with purple lines while the prey was still in the air. When the prey was completely charred, the little dragon let it fall and ate it with an expression of joy and cruelty. After devouring the 4th rabbit, the little dragon looked at Jon with its golden draconic eyes. If you dare to ask for more, I'll try dragon soup today. Seeing the little dragon looking at him, Jon showed a calm expression and spoke in a threatening tone. The little dragon looked pitiful and approached Jon, sitting on his lap and resting its head on his leg. Knowing what the dragon wanted, Jon sighed and began to stroke the soft scales, especially under the mouth and behind the head. The little dragon had the most beautiful scales he had ever seen, and when the light from the flames fell on them, they glowed beautifully. Your rider will certainly have a hard time with you, greedy cub. Jon commented with a smile on his lips as he watched the dragon cub enjoy his caresses. As if to answer Jon, the young dragon let out a guttural sound and relaxed even more. Jon leaned back against the tree, the 2 swords, Lady Lya and Dark Sister, at his right and left sides. Then he closed his eyes. When he opened them again, Jon found himself in front of a sea of blue roses, the same place he liked to spend his dreams, but the figure of the young woman in front of him made him let out a tired sigh. He did not like Rhaenys entering his dream, but not for selfish reasons or simply because he did not want her company. It was because his mind was dangerous to anyone, the weight of seeing the future weighing heavily on his mind. If it hadn't been for the maturation of his powers and his mental stamina, he would have gone mad or just plain crazy, like a certain Oraculo from Camp Half-Blood. But with Rhaenys in his dream, Jon had to protect her while withstanding twice as much pressure as normal. That's why he liked talking to Brynden. The man didn't need his protection and could withstand the influence of his mind on his own. Looking at Rhaenys, Jon noticed that she was taller than the last time. At 13, the girl was almost 164 centimeters, 5.4 tall, her body beginning to blossom as a girl of her age should. Her childish features were set aside to accentuate her naturally elegant and sharp features. But if there was one thing that hadn't changed, it was her gaze, looking at him as someone to be protected. My little Valonqar, Rhaenys said, embracing Jon in a strong, warm embrace. Note: Valonqar equals younger brother. Please stop invading my dreams, you impertinent dragon. Jon commented as he gently stroked her hair, which was easy for him since he was taller than her. Proposal denied. Rhaenys replied in an arrogant, smug tone. Letting out a helpless sigh, Jon turned away and spoke in a casual tone. Too bad, I had a surprise for you, but it looks like I'll be keeping it. Rhaenys' eyes lit up at Jon's words and she circled him like a wolf, as if trying to guess what his surprise was. Finally, seeing no hint on his body, she tired of waiting and asked with an urgent touch. What is Valonqar? It was Jon's first gift to her, how could she not be excited and happy? Before that, let me tell you what happened on that trip to the Wall. Jon didn't rush to introduce the dragon cub to Rhaenys, focusing on Aemon's existence. After hearing what had happened at the Wall, Rhaenys' eyes widened in shock, especially knowing that there were 2 other Targaryens still alive in Westeros. Aemon Targaryen, son of Mikar I and Brynden River, son of Aegon IV. Rhaenys whispered, still shocked to see 2 people so old, especially Brynden, who was almost 120 years old. At the same time, knowing that Brynden was a green seer who could see the future, and had the children of the forest as his guardians, made her imagine that she was in an ancient and epic story from the Age of Heroes. I didn't expect there to be so many Targaryens still alive in the world. Rhaenys sighed and smiled happily. In her eyes there was nothing happier than a large family. However, upon learning that her younger brother was in possession of the Dark Sister, Rhaenys' breath quickened, her eyes practically glowing with an excitement that made Jon roll his eyes at her naked desire for the legendary Valyrian steel sword of House Targaryen. I already have my meteorite steel sword, and the Dark Sister will be yours when we meet in person. Just as Jon finished his sentence, Rhaenys had leapt at him, throwing him into the sea of blue roses and kissing him on the cheek with a joy that was simply infectious. I love you, Valonqar. Rhaenys spoke as she kissed Jon's face endlessly with an extremely bright look on her face, like a child who has just earned a new toy. Sophist, you only said that because you won a legendary sword. Despite saying this, Jon's lips curved into a gentle smile. Besides, the surprise I prepared for you isn't Dark Sister. The kissing stopped abruptly when Rhaenys heard Jon's words and she looked at him in confusion. Was there anything more shocking in her eyes than one of the 3 most legendary swords in Westeros? Suddenly, Rhaenys heard the winter flowers rustle behind her, while a sound reminiscent of a roar, but childish and more cute than threatening, sounded extremely proud. Leaving Jon's body, she turned around and what she saw simply made her open her mouth in utter shock. A winged reptilian cub was staring at her with a proud and noble look in its golden eyes. Rhaenys wiped her eyes as if she was imagining things. Pointing a shaky finger at the dragon cub, Rhaenys tried to sound coherent, but her mind was in such shock that it was practically impossible. "D-Dragon! Stop yelling!" Jon said with an annoyed sound as he covered his ears with his hands. "Why are you so calm? It's a dragon cub. Every Targaryen's dream." Rhaenys shook her brother back and forth as she yelled at him for being so casual about something so incredible. "Obviously because I've had this dragon cub for over a month." Escaping Rhaenys' claws, Jon casually replied, turning away from his older sister. Looking at Jon angrily, as if she blamed him for not introducing her to the dragon cub sooner, Rhaenys turned her attention back to the dragon cub and couldn't help but think what a beautiful creature it was. Suddenly, before Rhaenys' shocked eyes, the silver dragon cub flew into the air and landed gracefully on her shoulder. She could feel the dragon's tail curling around her neck as a warmth was transmitted by the touch. The warmth was like standing next to a fire to warm yourself. Looking away, Rhaenys could see the dragon's golden eyes up close, and for some reason she felt something being established between her and the dragon cub. A strangely comfortable connection, as if she had 2 minds, one connected to the other. Watching the scene, Jon's lips curved into a smile. House Targaryen had its 2nd dragon rider. Together with the dragon eggs he had asked Kinvara to buy from Illyrio Mopatis earlier, House Targaryen would soon have 3 more dragon riders, making a total of 5. "Congratulations, she's accepted you as her knight," Jon commented, feigning a bitter tone as if Rhaenys had just claimed the dragon he wanted. Rhaenys' face went from confusion to pure ecstasy and then to pure sadness. The change in expression was so quick that it stunned Jon. Women were truly born to act. Rhaenys felt a deep sense of shame. Her brother would be king, the dragon should have been his, not hers. Her brother only wanted to show her the dragon and she stole it from him. How could she not be ashamed? "Enar." Before she could finish, she saw the teasing look in her brother's eyes and knew immediately that she had been fooled by his act. He was not sad at all that she had stolen his dragon cub. "Ha ha ha ha." Jon couldn't help himself and started to laugh. Don't blame him, Rhaenys' expression was really funny in his eyes. Looking at him fiercely, Rhaenys sat down next to him and spoke in a soft tone. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to take the dragon cub." Wiping the tears from his eyes from laughing so hard, Jon replied nonchalantly. "I have a dragon bigger than any ship in the world, we were born at the same time and we're brothers, his name is Caraxes. I don't need such a young dragon." Jon's words made Rhaenys open her mouth again in shock. She felt like this day was getting crazier and crazier. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked with a slightly annoyed expression. If she had known that her brother had a dragon, she wouldn't have worried so much about him before. "Because I wanted to see your reaction and I have to admit that it was worth waiting 4 years." Jon replied with a satisfied smile after everything that had just happened. Punching Jon hard in the arm, Rhaenys snorted coldly and spoke. "I'll pay you back for this one day." Jon shrugged and spoke with a smile, pointing to the dragon cub. "Have you chosen a name?" Rhaenys looked at the cub on her lap for a moment and spoke softly. Moonfire. Chapter 32, Return to Winterfell 3. What are you fighting for? Money, women, the promise of a better life? Know that you are more determined than many who live just to live. Enar Targaryen, God Emperor of the known universe. Opening his eyes, Jon looked at the dragon cub and called out her name softly. Moonfire. That's a good name, isn't it? Cub, he said, stroking the scales under her mouth. Moonfire was a female dragon and would be one of the most important to House Targaryen. In the future, most of his children would have a Moonfire egg placed in their cradle when they were born, as tradition demanded. He would care for the chick until his sister arrived at Winterfell, which, truth be told, wasn't far away, about a year and a half away. Feeling the sun's rays on his face, Jon knew it was already dawn and wanted to return to Winterfell as soon as possible. It was important to convince his uncle that war was inevitable, and it was. After eating some beef jerky, Jon didn't stand still and immediately packed his things, ready to ride, which he did. He took the 2 swords, put Moonfire in the wooden cage and covered it with a cloth, then immediately mounted his horse and rode toward Winterfell. He was not far from the ancestral home of House Stark, about half a day's ride. Half a day later, when the sun was high in the sky, Jon passed a hill and saw a stone fortress with the banner of a grey wolf on a white background. Winterfell. Passing through Wintertown, Jon picked up the sword he had ordered from the blacksmith before he left and headed for the gates of Winterfell. Leaving the horse with a young servant, Jon took the 2 swords, slung them at his waist while holding the cage containing Moonfire, and entered the castle, heading straight for Eddard Stark's Solar. Knocking gently on the door of Lord Stark's Solar, Jon waited for permission to enter. "Come in." Hearing the strong, calm voice, Jon opened the door, revealing the interior of the Solar, nothing too luxurious, just comfortable. The ancestral sword of House Stark stood proudly on the wall, showing its enormous size. His uncle wasn't alone. There was the Master-at-Arms of Winterfell, Ser Roderick Castle, the only knight of the North present in Lord Stark's Solar. "Uncle, I have important news." Ignoring the Master-at-Arms' doubtful look, Jon spoke in an undeniably serious tone. Eddard frowned and nodded, looking at his Master-at-Arms and speaking in a majestic tone. "Sire, I will speak with my son alone." "Yes, my lord." Roderick nodded and left the Solar with quick steps. Turning to his nephew, Eddard asked in a confused tone. "What happened, Jon?" "The trip to Wall was fruitful." Jon spoke with a slight strain in his voice, then drew the sword at his left side from its scabbard. As the sword emerged from its scabbard and was revealed to the world, Eddard's expression changed dramatically. If there was one thing all the nobles learned after Aegon's conquest, it was about dragons, Targaryen kings, and the legendary Valyrian swords. Thus, every nobleman could recognize the legendary sword of House Targaryen, the Dark Sister. "Why in the name of the old gods are you so special, Jon?" Eddard slumped in his chair. "What can I do? I try to be normal, but the world won't have it." Jon cracked a joke, but Eddard Stark didn't laugh. On the contrary, he gave him a reproachful look. "You have a terrible sense of humor, uncle." Jon shrugged and continued. "But it's not Dark Sister I want you to see, it's this." Jon's words made Eddard's expression show a hint of confusion, the Lord of Winterfell's gaze falling on the cage his nephew was holding. He had originally thought that Jon had just found a bird to raise or an eagle, so he hadn't given the cage much thought. The words that were about to leave his lips were trapped when the cloth covering the cage was removed, revealing the animal inside. Eddard looked at the creature in the cage and remained silent for a long time. "And what do I think it is, Jon?" he asked, but he didn't need an answer from his nephew. The difference between a lizard and a dragon was as obvious as the sun and the moon. "If you think it's a dragon, you're right, uncle," Jon replied, opening the cage and taking Moonfire in his arms. The young dragon was curious about his new surroundings and looked around. A long sigh came from Eddard Stark's lips. He looked at the creature that had brought the last Winter King to his knees and didn't know what to say for a moment. "Is this your dragon?" Eddard asked, even though he knew the answer, but the next words made the Lord of the North stand up in utter disbelief. "It's not my sister Rhaenys Targaryen's dragon," Jon replied, stroking the scaly head of Moonfire, who enjoyed the caress. "What are you talking about, Jon?" Eddard asked, his voice as stern as it could be at the moment. The image of bodies covered in a red sheet and Robert laughing so happily flashed through his mind. "Ser Jaime Lannister rescued my sister and Prince Oberyn Martell took Rhaenys from King's Landing and raised her as a bastard daughter named Rhaena Sand," Jon replied, looking distractedly at Moonfire, who had a sad and distant look on his face. Before Eddard could ask how he knew this, Jon continued. I heard about Robert, my cousin who killed my father and laughed under the bodies of my good mother and my brother Aegon. The queen was raped and cut in half by Gregor Clegane's sword, and baby Aegon had his face smashed against the wall. Jon spoke, Lord Stark's expression showing clear shame, remorse and regret at hearing the gruesome fate of Queen Elia and her son Aegon. Not caring what Eddard Stark thought, Jon continued. Tell me, uncle, what should I do? I want revenge. My mother would have survived if she had been in the Red Keep surrounded by the best masters. I want revenge on Tywin Lannister, Robert Baratheon, Gregor Clegane. I want to kill them all. Looking directly into Eddard Stark's eyes, Jon spoke in a cold, chilling tone. I want war. A shiver ran through Eddard's glass as the words fell from his nephew's lips. The determination in each word shook him to the core. The boy was ready to bear the brunt of the consequences of war. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when Eddard opened them again, there was only a calm, silent look in his eyes. Do you know what your words mean, Jon? He asked, the Lord of the North's voice carrying a heavy, dignified feeling. To throw this continent back into the flames of war and perhaps the source of hundreds of thousands of deaths. Jon replied in an equally deadly tone. And you still want war? The Lord of Winterfell asked, Jon noticing his jaw clenched. Yes. They killed my family, banished my grandmother and my aunts, and hunted them like animals on another continent. They have to pay for what they did to my family. I want the war to happen. Jon answered directly. He didn't say nice or honorable words, just the plain truth. I have Dorne. I will have Reach when the time is right, so I ask you, will you side with me or with my cousin? Jon asked, looking at his uncle. Hearing about Dorne and Reach, Eddard knew at that moment that Jon had probably already made up his mind before telling him. Do I have a choice, Jon? Eddard commented with a tone of helplessness. If Jon's identity was revealed, his lie would also be revealed, and he could imagine the look of pain on Robert's face when he found out. No matter what happened, Robert would declare war on the North when Jon's true identity was revealed to the world, and he would be considered a traitor along with the entire House Stark. You don't have to worry so much, uncle. We have a dragon and possibly 3 kingdoms, better than when Aegon started. Jon said, looking down at the small dragon cub on his lap. Aegon's dragons were adults. Eddard rolled his eyes at his nephew's optimism. But I have an adult dragon. Jon replied with a mischievous grin, causing Eddard to widen his eyes in shock. How? Remember when I ran away for a few days when I was younger? Well, let's just say it wasn't to prove I was powerful, but to visit my dragon Caraxes. Jon spoke with an amused smile on his lips. This left Eddard speechless. Today was truly a day of revelations he hadn't expected when this day began. With a sigh, Eddard shooed his nephew away with a look of helplessness on his face. Get out of my solar, I need to think about your problems. Jon shrugged and left the solar, leaving the Lord of Winterfell alone. In the chair, Eddard stared at the ceiling, lost in thought, and whispered to himself. Robert, you won't blame me, will you? I'm doing this for the family as you would for yours. Chapter 33, King's Landing. Betrayal hurts because it always comes from the people you least expect. Aenar Targaryen, seeing the fury in King Robert I Baratheon's eyes as he gazes upon the Lord of Winterfell. Crown Lands. King's Landing. Inside the huge red fortress built beneath Aegon's Hill, in the small council chamber. 7 men sat in their respective positions. Just as everyone was about to start the meeting, the camera doors were opened and a strong smell of wine floated into the room. All 7 men rose from their seats and spoke at the same time. Your Grace. Whoever came in was a tall and mostly fat man. If someone had told them that this man had been known as the Demon of the Trident 10 years ago, no one would have believed them. Robert I. Baratheon was a shell of his former self, a distant echo of the man he once was. Taking a sip of wine from the mug, Robert ignored everyone and sat down on the main chair with his fat body, looking at his advisors with his deep blue eyes. His black hair was disheveled and his beard was large and dirty. Frankly, if it weren't for the expensive and noble clothes, it was hard to believe that such a man was the king of an entire continent. Robert looked more like a mercenary from Essos than a king. Anyone present could see that, but no one said anything or dared, not even the hand of the king, Jon Arryn. Lord Arryn looked at Robert with a hint of helplessness in his usually stern expression. He snorted loudly and began to speak. With the king's arrival, we will begin the small council. My lords, there are 2 important pieces of news that my little birds have heard recently. The gentle words, soft and even too delicate for a man, caught everyone's attention, including Robert, who was still drinking non-stop. "We are listening, Lord Varys." Lord Arryn commented, gesturing for Varys to continue. Yes, the bald fat man was Varys, the spider, the eunuch, the master of whispers. Varys is a chubby, bald eunuch with soft white hands and round shoulders. The Lord of Winterfell, Eddard of House Stark, has begun the renovation of the Kaelin Moat, which will be the fief of his second son, Brandon Stark. Varys spoke in a soft voice, his small eyes narrowing slightly, a smile on his lips as the Master of Whispers glanced discreetly at everyone present. Ha 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 ha! Robert laughed at the mention of his brother coming from the eunuch. Although they didn't share blood, they had grown up together and were closer than his own blood brothers. This silent wolf has 5 children and the 6th is on the way. Robert was in a good mood and took another sip of wine, apparently to toast his great friend, or was it just another reason for him to drink until he passed out? Your Grace, I don't think it's appropriate for Lord Stark to complete such a project. If the Kaelin Moat is successfully rebuilt, it will be extremely difficult for armies to invade the north in the future. The master of the ships, Stannis Baratheon, spoke at that moment. His voice was as serious and calm as one would expect from a man. Bang! Robert had slammed the table down so hard that everyone was stunned for a moment. The king's blue eyes glared at his brother. Don't you dare slander Ned with your paranoia, Stannis? Robert nearly roared at his younger brother. I can trust that man with my back without hesitation. Stannis felt a sense of humiliation and anger at the angry outburst from his king and brother. He was only thinking of his family, but Robert couldn't see how dangerous it was to have an untouchable north. But as a loyal vassal and brother to the king, Stannis still had to warn of the consequences of the north's actions. You can trust him, but what about your children and the children after them? Then marry my children to his. Robert replied angrily. He trusted Ned and trusted even more in the upbringing the Lord of Winterfell would give his children. The King of the Seven Kingdoms had no doubt that all the sons and daughters of the Lord of the North would be honorable men and women. Surprisingly, Jon Arryn nodded in satisfaction at Robert's words. Your Grace has made a good proposal. We can marry Princess Myrcella to Robb Stark and Prince Tommen to Lady Sansa Stark. Lord Arryn didn't know it, but those words had changed his fate. Robert just let out a satisfied grunt in agreement with Jon Arryn's words. Turning back to Varys, Robert asked in a slightly impatient voice. What is the second important matter, eunuch? Varys' face remained unchanged as he listened to the king's words. He simply stood and answered in a respectful tone. The Red Faith has received Queen Mother Rhaella and Princesses Visenya and Daenerys Targaryen. A snarl came from Robert's lips when he heard the eunuch's words. And what does the Red Faith want with the dragon spawn? Varys looked at the king about to explode with fury and couldn't help thinking that Robert was also a dragon spawn, since his grandmother was a legitimate Targaryen. Which, ironically, was Robert's greatest claim to the Iron Throne. Unfortunately, that is beyond my information. Varys replied, bowing apologetically. A goblet of wine was thrown towards Varys, but he missed, the goblet passing dangerously close to him while the eunuch remained with the same gentle, courteous smile. Useless eunuch, I pay for your services and you don't know something so basic. Robert, who had thrown a goblet at Varys, roared angrily, his eyes practically burning with rage. Varys wanted to roll his eyes. He was a spy, not a mind reader. How could he know what the Red Faith were thinking when they received the queen and the princesses? Of course he couldn't say, or his head would be on a pike the next morning after he spoke his mind. I will redouble my efforts, your grace. Varys spoke, bending down even more as he reached under the long, loose sleeves of his clothing, his fingers playing with the ring on his ring finger. Robert just snorted coldly and looked at his master of coin, Peter Baelish. The master of coin was a small man with a slender build. He had distinctive features, a small pointed beard on his chin, and dark hair with gray streaks running through it. He had laughing gray-green eyes that resembled the eyes of a cat. How much will it cost to take the lives of the 3 prostitutes? Robert asked, causing everyone to look at the king in disbelief, especially Jon Arryn, who looked at the boy he had raised like a son with a look of shock. If it's the House of Black and White, I'm afraid we can't afford it, your grace. With a polite smile.
Look, if you've actually made it this far into the video and you're still here, come on then, hit subscribe. And honestly, if you think a friend of yours would like this, go on and share it with them. It really helps out. Right, I'm done. I'll get out of your hair now so you can get back to the good stuff. But seriously, stick around till the end. It's well worth it.
Littlefinger replied by bowing to Robert, whose expression grew even more somber at his words. Robert took a sip of wine to clear his throat and spoke in a cold tone, looking directly at Peter. I don't care how you do it, ask House Tyrell, the Iron Bank, or Old Tywin for money, I want the Targaryen bitches dead. I'll do as you say, your grace. Smiling, Peter bowed and replied in a confident tone. Without waiting for everyone's reaction, Robert left with an irritated look on his face. His day had been made worse by the news of the remnants of House Targaryen. He hated anything to do with those incestuous abominations. Jon Arryn let out a helpless sigh, only he knew how much work it was to keep the kingdom of the Seven Kingdoms whole and without too many rebellions, how many nights he stayed up to maintain what they had conquered. At first he tried to get Robert to attend the small council meetings, but he soon discovered something. Robert was not meant to be king, he was a general, not a king. Jon Arryn looked at everyone present and spoke in a serious and dignified tone. We will meet again at Wolf time, please be there. With that, everyone left the small council chamber and split off in different directions. Standing in front of a window that overlooked the whole of King's Landing, Varys couldn't help but sigh softly. Compared to Essos, Westeros was even crueler and colder, conspiracy and betrayal were the norm between these red walls, but he didn't dislike it, on the contrary, it felt like he was finally home. Speaking of Essos, I hope Lord Jon Connington is taking good care of young Prince Aegon. Varys thought with a small smile on his face, his gaze crossing the window and falling on King's Landing. Today was a better day than yesterday. Chapter 34, King's Landing 2. Beware, words are often deadlier than any poison or weapon. Tyrion Lannister, Hand of the King. Crack! The expensive vase of myrrh was thrown against the wall of the room as a high-pitched scream full of malice rang out between the walls. I'm going to kill him! Filthy old man! How dare you think of taking my children away from me? The one who shouted was a strikingly beautiful woman with curly golden hair, emerald green eyes, fair skin, and a slender, graceful figure. The woman was none other than the Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, Light of the West, and daughter of Old Lion Cersei Lannister. Keep your voice down, sister. The wall has ears. On the bed, naked with only a thin sheet covering his nakedness, was a tall, muscular man. His hair was the same shade of gold as the woman's, and his eyes were almost identical. It was as if the man was the male version of the woman. The man was Jaime Lannister, the youngest Kingsguard, having joined the prestigious order at the tender age of 15, but he also had another name, Kingslayer. Why aren't you angry? He's taking our children. Cersei, also naked, shouted at her brother with an expression more reminiscent of a snake than a lion. A naked Jaime rose from the bed and embraced his sister from behind, kissing her gently on the curve of her neck. They're a prince and a princess, one day they'll get married and have a family, it's the natural order of the world, Cersei. If anyone saw what was happening in the room at that moment, it would surely cause many to criticize and even discuss the incestuous act of brother and sister. The Faith of the Seven in particular would do anything to make Cersei pay for her sinful and reprehensible actions in the Seven Hells. Jaime's words, however, had the opposite effect he intended and only made Cersei angrier. I will not force my daughter to spread her legs for a damned barbarian from the north. Cersei spoke in a cold, murderous tone. What are you going to do? Noticing the look in her eyes, Jaime asked, his voice slightly strained. When his sister had that look, someone was going to die. Kill Jon Arryn. Cersei spat out the sentence with the most viciousness imaginable. You're mad, he's the Hand of the King, Lord of the Vale and Warden of the East. Jaime couldn't imagine his sister being crazy enough to kill Jon Arryn. She wasn't talking about some minor noble or commoner, but the lord of one of the 7 great houses of Westeros. Cersei turned and faced Jaime with a smile. She wrapped her arms around his bare waist and spoke in a calm tone. Who cares, you killed a king, is he greater than a king? Will you do this for me, Jaime? Cersei whispered in his ear as her green eyes fixed on him with a seductive, sexy light. No. Turning away from her, Jaime resolutely refused, even though he wanted to accept the offer to make Cersei happy. At the same time, the image of him plunging his sword into Aerys Tooth's back flashed through his mind, causing a ringing in his ear. Approaching again, Cersei held his face and spoke in a cold tone. Jaime, I found out he was looking for Pycelle to see the family tree of House Baratheon. If he finds out, you know what will happen to Tommen, Myrcella, and Joffrey." Hearing these words, Jaime's face finally showed some hesitation. He didn't care about Joffrey, but he did care about Myrcella and Tommen, sweet, adorable children. Letting out a sigh of sadness, Jaime spoke in a lower tone than usual. "All right, I would." A smile appeared on Cersei's lips as she led Jaime to the bed and knelt between his legs. "Let me make you relax," she whispered as she opened her mouth and moved forward. Jaime showed a comfortable expression as the guilt in his heart disappeared with the pleasure of Cersei's mouth around his length. "You will die, Jon Arryn." It was Jaime's last thought before he surrendered to the pleasure. Little did Jon Arryn know that his life was about to be put in danger over a proposal. He was finally going to investigate a suspicion he had harbored for years but never found the time to pursue. If his suspicions were confirmed, it would be an event that would be remembered for generations. Opening the door to the tower where the Grand Maester resided, Jon Arryn found Pycelle quietly reading a book. The old man was cowardly and incompetent. Were it not for Tywin Lannister's influence, Jon would have gotten rid of the decrepit man. "I need a book." Jon Arryn's voice was direct, breaking the silence and surprising Pycelle for a moment. "What book do you want, Lord Hand?" The Maester's weak, hoarse voice sounded unpleasant, but Jon ignored the annoyance. "The Book of the Air." Jon Arryn's eyes were fixed as he stared at the old man. For a moment, Pycelle's movements hesitated, but then resumed their usual slowness. A reaction that went unnoticed by Jon and which, even if noticed, he would probably attribute to the Maester's advanced age. "I'll look for the book and send it to your chambers, Lord Hand," Pycelle replied. Jon's satisfaction was evident in his expression as he turned and left the tower. As Hand of the King, Jon had numerous duties to fulfill, but now he was also determined to begin investigating his suspicions. If they were confirmed, he knew he would face a difficult dilemma. He could foresee that, if he discovered the truth, the reputation of House Lannister would be irreparably tarnished. Tywin Lannister, the Old Lion, would do anything to silence such rumors. It was no secret that Tywin wanted to see his blood on the Iron Throne and would do anything to make it happen. Jon had no doubt that a war could break out at that moment. He had to be prepared to prevent the kingdom from plunging into another civil conflict like the one that had occurred a decade ago. There was yet another problem: the line of succession to the Iron Throne. Robert had no legitimate heirs, and the heir presumptive would be Stannis Baratheon, at least until a new heir was born. Although this solution was temporary, it did not please the Hand of the King. Stannis was not fit to be king but a general. That was Jon Arryn's main concern. He was sure that if Stannis took over the Iron Throne, many nobles would end up dead because of the Lord of Dragonstone's ruthless and obsessive sense of justice. In addition, under Stannis' reign, all bars, brothels, and any form of entertainment would be banned, not just in King's Landing, but throughout the Seven Kingdoms. Jon had no doubt that a rebellion would break out before he had even been in power for a year. Rumor had it that Stannis saw sex only as a means of reproduction, never as something for pleasure. It was known that the Lord of Dragonstone had not shared a bed with his wife for months, perhaps years. Another alternative would be Renly Baratheon, Robert's younger brother and current Master of Laws. However, this option was even more inconceivable to Jon Arryn. He would never allow a sword swallower, as evil tongues referred to Renly, to sit on the Iron Throne. And after Renly? What would happen? As far as he knew, the Master of Laws had never slept with a woman, openly preferring male company. How could such a man be accepted as king? While pondering the succession crisis, Jon felt a headache forming. His thoughts then turned to Eddard Stark, another of his sons by upbringing. Eddard had 5 sons and a 6th was on the way. The prosperity of his house was enviable. Jon couldn't help but compare. While House Stark faced no succession problems, the crown was on the brink of chaos with a possible succession crisis. "I just hope my suspicions are only suspicions," Jon Arryn muttered to himself, begging the Seven to have mercy on Westeros and not to have another war in the future. It was the least he could do for the Seven Kingdoms, which he himself had led to war 10 years ago in what became known as Robert's Rebellion, bringing down the Targaryen dynasty after almost 300 years in power. Chapter 35: The Dragon Flies for the First Time. Ambition stems from the need to be something more, which has driven humanity since its beginnings. But at what cost? I will remake this society in my image, so that they will worship me as their god and emperor. Enar Targaryen, God Emperor of the Planets. 6th moon of the year 294 AC. Esso's free city of Volantis. Looking out over the city from the balcony of the Great Red Temple, Daenerys couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. The whole city seemed quieter than usual. The reason was simple. Volantis was about to be attacked by the greatest Khalasar in the Dothraki Sea. 40,000 men on horseback, led by Khal Drogo, the Khal who never lost a battle. Though she wasn't as interested in military matters as Visenya, she still knew the basics, but Daenerys didn't know how a nomadic tribe could meet the demand for so many men and horses. From her lessons with her sister Visenya, she knew that the foundation of any war was logistics. Without logistics, the battle couldn't even take place, and even if it did, it wouldn't last more than 3 days. How can you fight without food, steel, and swords? So, unlike the townspeople who were afraid, she wasn't afraid that even if there was an attack, the Dothraki couldn't withstand a war of resistance or a siege. Besides, Volantis had an army of 35,000 men in plate armor, making it one of the most powerful armies in Essos at the moment. Aside from horses, the other side had no armor and no swords capable of piercing armor. What could light cavalry like the Dothraki do against heavy infantry other than run away? Looking back into her room, Daenerys' lilac eyes fell on the 3 dragon eggs on the mantelpiece. She still hadn't managed to get the eggs to hatch, as her nephew had apparently said. Nephew? She still remembered her mother's expression of disbelief upon hearing of Enar's existence, the impact so great that the Queen of Westeros almost fainted from shock. Soon followed by a cry she never thought she would see her noble, strong mother cry in front of her. However, it was the first time Daenerys had seen her mother so happy. Daenerys didn't know what to feel for this sweet nephew she'd never met other than gratitude and happiness. The last year and a half had been the happiest of her life. Only someone who'd never had a safe home knows what it's like to live in fear of waking up to become a slave. Her nephew didn't know it, but he had made life better for her and the whole family. They had a chance to change and become stronger so that in the future they could help as much as possible and not just be a burden to her nephew when the time came. Still, even though she had never seen him or even known what he looked like, Daenerys had great affection for her nephew. A boy she had never met, but who for 4 years had commanded the Red Faith to seek out and protect her and her family. In her eyes, Enar was no different than the Prince Charming from an epic book from the Age of Heroes. He might as well have told me how to hatch the eggs. Daenerys looked at the 3 eggs in the fireplace and muttered to herself, puffing out her cheeks adorably. The tense atmosphere of the whole city didn't seem to bother the 11, almost 12-year-old. She had lived through too many murders to feel nervous at every moment of danger. While Daenerys was watching the dragon eggs and thinking of a way to hatch them, the bedroom door opened and a girl of about 6 years old entered the room. She had a round, flat face, dark skin, and eyes like molten gold, the typical features of the people of Noth. The girl wore a red robe, typical of the Red Faith, and looked very adorable. "Princess," Missandei spoke, her voice sweet and melodious. Daenerys turned to the girl and smiled. "Have you come to eat lemon tart with me again?" she asked in an amused tone. The Dragon Princess had met this young woman at the Great Red Temple months ago, and since then the two had been almost inseparable, Daenerys finally having her first true friend. Missandei's cheeks took on a faint blush at the mention of the lemon tart. She wanted the ground to open up and swallow her whole with the shame she felt at the moment. Although she was indeed greedy for the tart, she had come with another purpose, by order of the Reverend Mother. "Princess, the Reverend Mother has requested your presence in her solar," Missandei said in a very respectful tone. "Call me Dany." Nudging her cheek, the Dragon Princess spoke in a strong, unquestioning voice. "But you are a princess," Missandei muttered to herself. "Are you going to disobey me? A week without lemon tart." Daenerys flashed a wicked smile and threatened the 6-year-old girl without hesitation. Missandei's face showed an expression of struggle. Her brothers had specifically reminded her to be respectful of Daenerys and her family, but the thought of living without lemon treats was worse than death to her. Seeing the struggle in her expression, Daenerys' gaze softened and she spoke, embracing the girl. "You don't have to call me Dany in front of people, but call me Dany when we're alone." The fighting look on Missandei's face was improved by Daenerys' words. She nodded and spoke in her sweet voice, "Dany." Daenerys' smile widened as she heard this, and she followed the girl out of the room and toward the Reverend Mother's solar. As she walked through the corridors, Daenerys noticed the guards, servants, red priestesses, and others looking at her with respect and awe. But she knew their respect was not for her, but for her nephew. Their Messiah, the prophet who would lead them through the long night. The Son of Light. Honestly, she felt a sincere fear towards some of these people. They didn't treat her like a human, but almost like a goddess. At that moment, one of the men kneeled down with his forehead touching the ground, prostrating himself before her. If she felt like that, she couldn't imagine what her sweet nephew felt in front of these people. For these fanatics, he was their god and Messiah. Arriving at the Reverend Mother Solar, Daenerys entered with Missandei. As soon as she entered, she saw that her mother and sister had already arrived. Both were dressed as a queen and a princess. At the same time, Ser Willem, who was already old, was wearing white armor with a white cloak over his shoulders. Daenerys knew that this was the armor worn only by the Kingsguard. The moment Ser Willem earned that armor, she saw the man become emotional for the first time in years. Ser Willem had never been a Kingsguard, he was the master at arms of the Red Keep, but she knew the man had a dream of becoming a member of the Kingsguard, just like many boys in Westeros. Mother, sister, Ser Willem, Reverend Mother. Daenerys greeted everyone with a sweet, cheerful smile, making the atmosphere more relaxed, something she found she could do when things were too tense. Rhaella gestured for her daughter to sit next to her and looked at Reverend Mother. What do you wish to discuss, Lady Kinvara? Khal Drogo has the support of Braavos and other free cities to attack Volantis. Kinvara took a sip of wine and spoke in a calm tone, but the words made the previously relaxed atmosphere tense in an instant. Kinvara continued, her expression unchanged in the face of such a dangerous situation. The expansion of the Red Faith in these 5 years has made the free cities cautious. The massive growth of the Fiery Hand hasn't helped either, making the free cities unable to stand by and watch our power grow. Are we talking about supporting with soldiers or just supporting with logistics? Visenya asked, asking exactly what the problem was. Both options were bad news for the Volatins. If it was just logistical support, Volantis could retreat to the city and start a battle in the city. The Dothraki horses would be useless in the narrow streets of the city. Even blocking the streets with wooden stakes could prevent enemy troops from advancing. But if it's support with soldiers, that means the free cities have sent soldiers as well as logistical support. Which was bad news, since infantry could enter the city more easily than Dothraki cavalry. But since you're so calm, it looks like Volantis has a hidden trump card. Visenya finished, looking deeply at Kinvara. Kinvara looked at the 18-year-old girl with a hint of admiration. As the princess said, the Emperor's daughters have reported that the free cities have sent soldiers with a large amount of logistics. Enough supplies to sustain an army of hundreds of thousands for months. Fortunately, there weren't 100,000 men on the other side, only about 50 to 60,000 men. And how are we supposed to stop 60,000 men? Rhaella asked with a slightly helpless expression. Kinvara's next words, however, caused Rhaella's eyes and those of everyone else in the room to widen in shock. The Son of Light will come to Essos to destroy the army of sinners. His fire will purify the heretics and infidels. Chapter 36, The Dragon Flies for the First Time too. I looked into the abyss and, as expected, there was nothing there. Perhaps my mind is the real abyss. How many have gone mad just looking at it? Enar Targaryen, questioning his own humanity for the 1000th time. Westeros continent, North Winterfell Castle. Uncle, I'm going away for a few months. Eddard heard his nephew's words and looked in surprise at the tall, broad-shouldered young man before him. He looked nothing like the 11, almost 12-year-old young adult he was at the moment. If you had said Jon was 16 or 17, he would have easily believed you. Sometimes Eddard wondered if someone was feeding Jon giant wolf milk to make his nephew grow up so much in such a short time. Next to him, Robb looked like a little boy, and his son wasn't little, he was big for his age. Where are you going? Eddard asked curiously. After nearly 2 years of preparing for war, he and his nephew had become much closer. He was beginning to get to know the real Jon, not the boy he showed off to everyone. His nephew was terribly brilliant. His strategies, his courage, his daring, and his calm made the Lord of the North sigh that there really were people who were born to rule and command armies. Jon was just such a talented and brilliant person. I'm going to Essos. Jon replied in a calm tone, much more regal than a year ago. My grandmother and aunts are in danger. A horde of Dothraki is ready to invade Volantis. Eddard's face changed dramatically at his nephew's words. Though Jon spoke in a calm tone, how could he not see that this was a truly dangerous situation? "Will you ride your dragon?" Eddard frowned and asked, finally letting out a sigh. Though he knew this day would come, it came too soon. He had hoped to spend a few more years growing stronger, but it looked like war was just around the corner. "Don't worry, uncle, the plan will happen as planned in the year 296. Jon certainly knew of his uncle's concern and spoke up, calming the turbulent feelings in the chest of the most powerful man in the north. "Are you going to kill everyone?" Eddard asked, not knowing the size of the dragon called Caraxes, but knowing from his nephew's words that the creature was powerful. "They are rapists and a greater evil that must be exterminated." Jon spoke, his expression indifferent and cold. He would kill the men who could fight and let the women and children live. In a few centuries, these people will have forgotten the ways of the Dothraki and will choose to adapt or join another civilization. Jon didn't need rapists and thieves to bother him when he came to conquer Essos later. He could just as easily burn the whole V's Dothraki to the ground. As for conquering such a people, Jon didn't even think about it and resolutely refused. How much damage these people had already done to the world could not be calculated. Then let him act as God for the first time and purge this evil from the world. "When are you leaving?" Eddard asked with a hint of concern in his eyes. He didn't know what Jon was up to, but he knew his nephew, and he knew the boy could be a bit extreme when he needed to be. "I will leave immediately," Jon replied firmly, turning and heading for the door. "Before you go, talk to Robb. He's a smart boy and already suspects something," Eddard added in a tired, helpless tone. His son was intelligent and had already picked up some clues that something very important was going on. Jon nodded and left Eddard Stark's son. Robb arrived on the Winterfell balcony to find Jon holding a jug of wine and 2 glasses. "This is our father's private wine. How did you get it?" Robb asked, smiling as he poured himself a glass of wine. He brought it to his lips and sighed pleasantly at the slightly sweet and spicy taste. The air of Winterfell did not like the strong northern drink. It was the most unpalatable thing he had ever drunk in his life. "I stole it from him. I bet he'll be furious when he finds out," Jon replied with an equally amused smile. Jon and Robb hadn't noticed, but a pair of gray eyes were staring at them with a curious expression. The night sky cleared to reveal Arya's figure, secretly watching the 2 brothers. Jon looked at Robb and spoke, taking the air of the north by surprise. "I'm leaving in a few moments." "Where to?" he asked curiously. A look of envy appeared on Robb's face, knowing that Jon would be traveling far again. If there was one thing he wanted, it was to be able to travel freely. But as heir to Winterfell, he couldn't and probably wouldn't travel that far in his life. "The continent of Essos, Volantis to be exact," Jon replied. The words shocked Robb and Arya, who had been listening in secret. "That far?" Robb asked, still shocked at such a long and possibly dangerous journey. "They wouldn't see each other for years, would they? I have to rescue a queen and 2 princesses in a tower." Jon spoke in an amused tone, a smile playing on his lips. Robb thought Jon was joking with those words, but when he saw the purple eyes full of seriousness, he looked at Jon in shock. "You're not joking?" he asked, still shocked. Sipping his wine, Jon smiled at Robb and spoke in confirmation of his words. "Yes, I'm going to rescue Queen Rhaella Targaryen and her daughters, Princesses Visenya and Daenerys." "Why?" was the only thing that came out of Robb's mouth. "Wouldn't you save your family, Robb?" "I'm doing the same." Jon's words were like a punch to Robb's gut, making him look at Jon rigidly. Jon's words were no different than admitting that he was from House Targaryen. Trying to remember when House Stark married House Targaryen, Robb's face turned slightly pale at the thought of a certain possibility. "It seems you guessed. You were always good at analyzing things." Jon sighed when he saw the look on Robb's face. Jon continued. "Believe me, I was also surprised when I found out that my parents got married and conceived me in the middle of a war." Robb's expression softened at the mention of marriage. As long as Jon was not the product of rape, he was happy for his brother, or rather cousin. "Is that why you always were handsomer than me?" Robb, still shocked by the shocking news, tried to lighten the mood with a joke. Jon looked at Robb in amusement and spoke in a smug tone. "What can I do? I'm incredible in every sense of the word." Robb rolled his eyes and let out a sigh filled with complex emotions. "So you're the heir to the Iron Throne?" "That is true." Jon nodded. "What else do you want to tell me? Do you have a dragon too?" When Robb said it, it was a joke, but when he saw the smile on Jon's lips and the teasing look on his face, he swallowed. Filling the wine glass as full as he could, Robb drank all the wine in the glass in one go. "I need more, I'm not leaving until I'm unconscious," Robb muttered to himself, making Jon laugh. He really liked it when people found out about Caraxes. "Would you like to fly in Caraxes? I can take you," Jon invited Robb without hesitation. But the heir of Winterfell quickly shook his head and vehemently refused. "I'd rather stay safe on the ground with no chance of falling from the sky." "Coward." Jon snorted coldly with an amused look in his eyes. "I'm not a coward, but I don't see the point in taking unnecessary risks." Robb replied to Jon's words as if he were offended to be called a coward. Jon and Robb looked at each other and laughed, relieving the atmosphere of the shocking revelation they had just made. Arya, who had been hiding to listen, had her hand over her mouth to keep herself from crying or screaming in shock at Jon's words. She couldn't believe that her favorite brother was her cousin, her aunt's son, and the Silver Prince. But the scene in front of her made her accept the cruel reality. "Liar, when you come back, I'll demand that you take me 1,000,000 times to fly on your dragon," Arya thought as tears fell from her eyes and streamed down her cheeks. Chapter 37, The Dragon Flies for the First Time 3. From this moment on, my name is Enar Targaryen, first of my name. God Emperor of Planetos, Enar Targaryen. North Wolfswood. In front of the dragon's cave, Jon began to whisper an ancient song. Name of the song: Heros Bartasai. Drakari Pikairos. Tikumo Gemiros. Yn Lantas Bartasa. Salit Vadis. Translation: Fire Breather. Winged Leader. But 2 heads. To a third sing. When Jon began, his voice spread through the dimness of the forest. The voice was melodic, beautiful, yet powerful. Heavy footsteps were heard coming from the cave. Jon raised the pitch of his voice. Hen Nuhar Eleni. Persisi Vestridis. Se Jelen Iridax. Anagros. Translation: From my voice. The fires have spoken. And the price has been paid. With blood magic. A huge figure emerged from the cave, its long neck snaking through the air as its body made the ground shake. The crimson color of the beast could be seen even in the darkest night. Perzyro Udrisai. Izimtos Lihasi. Harasa Ledigon. Aodi Vaden. Translation: With words of flame. With clear eyes. To bind the 3. To you I sing. Rhhhoar. With a thunderous roar that rang out in the night, blood-red flames lit up the sky while the fierce, demonic head could be seen in the light of the red flames. Jon, illuminated by the crimson dragon fire, didn't stop. He continued chanting with even more fervor. Hey Merit Gerali. Se Heros Bartasai. Primisa Sovalai. Jevi Dari. Translation: As one we gather. And with 3 heads. We shall fly as we were destined. Beautifully, freely. With the end of the Valyrian music, Caraxes stopped the crimson fire and lowered his massive body to the ground, revealing a cell bound by steel mesh around the dragon's powerful and strong chest. Jon, wearing black armor full of intricate details and a red cloak over his shoulders, climbed over the steel netting and reached the black leather cell, where he fastened the belt connected to the cell by thick steel chains around his waist. Suvgan Caraxes. Jon, or rather Enar Targaryen, spoke in High Valyrian. The dragon obeyed, rising from the ground and towering above the trees with its enormous size. It began to walk at a fast pace and soared into the sky with the beat of powerful wings and the sound of rustling trees all around. Enar grabbed the cell's levers and leaned forward as the dragon soared high into the night sky with powerful, sonorous flaps. His silver hair fluttered violently against the cold, deadly north wind. It was the first time he had ever flown so high in the sky, and the cold wind, he thought, did not exist, not with a dragon that radiated more heat than an extremely hot furnace. To be honest, Enar hadn't expected to reveal himself a year ahead of schedule. He had overestimated the patience of the free cities. At the same time, his prescience wasn't strong enough to predict the future from such a distance. This led to the events of Volantis, but Enar didn't think it was as bad as others might have thought, especially since it was a great opportunity to gain prestige quickly, powerfully, and in a big way. This battle would be perfect for forging his and Carax's names. When anyone thought of fighting him, they would have to think of what would become known as the Second Field of Fire. The complete burning of an army of tens of thousands. Looking at the towns that seemed so small with only a few houses still lit, Enar felt like the king of the world. He wondered if that was how Aegon the Conqueror felt as he flew to Westeros with his sisters/wives. Though he wasn't going to Essos to conquer at the moment, he was going to kill, and though it wasn't as noble a purpose as Aegon's, it was still honorable to kill the world's greatest rapists. Near the confluence of the Shivering Sea and the Narrow Sea, 20 kilometers from Braavos. The sky was clear and there was no sign of storm clouds, so the captain of the Mermaid Queen, Jack Morn, thanked the gods for the sunny day. There had been 5 storms in the last month alone, and even he, accustomed to the temperamental sea, felt that someone had offended a god. "Come on boys, we're close to Braavos, we want to get off before dark and maybe we can go to the Bordel and have some fun." Jack shouted to the ship's crew, followed by whistles and excited laughter at the idea of spending the night with a harlot in the harbor of Braavos. Jack nodded in satisfaction as his crew cheered him on. He took the canteen of water from his waist and brought it to his mouth, where he began to drink the most precise liquid in the sea, fresh water. Suddenly, the thunderous sound of flapping wings made him almost drop the canteen in fright, but the surprise didn't stop there. The ship suddenly tilted sideways into a small dip in the waves. Had it not been for his 20 years of experience, he would have fallen, sinking the ship with his mistake. Jack managed to stand upright and turn the ship's wheel in the other direction as he stared at the sky in utter horror and terror. The huge shadow could easily cover 8 of his ship with the size of its wings, while the crimson color filled his entire field of vision. The encounter lasted only a few moments, but Jack would never forget the giant crimson dragon flying above him. Swallowing dryly, he swore he saw someone riding the huge crimson beast, the white-gold color of his hair so obvious that he couldn't have missed it. However, Jack's expression changed dramatically when he noticed the direction in which what he assumed to be a dragon was heading, toward the most powerful free city on the continent of Essos, the city of 100 islands, Braavos. "Dragon? Captain, did we drink too much or did we really see a damn dragon? Captain, can we go somewhere else? I don't want to turn into dragon dung. I still have a pregnant mother and a beautiful wife waiting for me at home to take care of them." "You like giving your ass, you son of a bitch, what a wife you have. Who says I can't be married because of that?" Did anyone notice that he said his mother was pregnant while his wife wasn't? Was it just me who found that odd? "Captain, I have to go to the bathroom, I feel like I've shit myself." Hearing the voices of his crew, Jack smiled helplessly, but was still grateful to have such a brave crew. Anyone else would probably have jumped into the sea in such fear. "Shut up, you bastards, and set sail. We want to get to Braavos, or what's left of it, as soon as possible. And Jason, go and change your clothes, you stink of shit." Jack shouted loudly, pointing at the newest recruit who had shit his pants. "Yes, Captain," Jason said with an embarrassed look on his face and ran towards the interior of the ship, listening to the laughter of his companions. "I hope Braavos is still standing." Jack muttered to himself, knowing that the city had little chance of surviving a surprise attack from a dragon that size. Enar didn't know that he had scared a poor ship, and even if he did, he would probably laugh and fly around the ship a few more times, just to scare them a few more times. Sadistic? He didn't think so. His sense of humor was very good. Anyone who disagreed was not riding a dragon. It had been hours since he had left Westeros. The journey was going more smoothly than he had expected. There were no storms on the way, making the weather very pleasant for a flight. However, Enar could see that the hours-long journey was beginning to take its toll on his brother's body. The dragon had slowed down a lot compared to its initial speed when they left Westeros. Enar knew he had to land somewhere to rest and fly on to Volantis as quickly as possible. Enar naturally chose Braavos as a resting place. He really wanted to see the look on the face of the Sea Lord of Braavos when he saw the dragon flying over his city. He'd probably have a heart attack and die, right? From what he remembered, the man was old and very ill. At the same time, it was a warning that if they didn't behave, he wouldn't mind punishing the bastard city that had fled Valyria. He, Enar Targaryen, first of his name, was not exactly a sympathetic man like Jon Snow. Chapter 38, The Bastard Daughter of the Valyrian Freehold. The Sea Lord of Braavos is truly arrogant. Enar Targaryen thought at the sight of the first sword of Braavos. Free city of Braavos. Belgir Otherys remained indifferent to the screams of terror outside. The barge she was on was more opulent than any palace she could find. The finest and most expensive silks in Myr, goose feather pillows, pearls scattered everywhere, gold and silver decorating the walls in beautiful and elegant detail. There were cold drinks even on the hottest day and warm, cozy sheets at night, her bed as wide as a third of the ship itself. She was certainly treated like a worthy queen. But the reason Belgier didn't run away like everyone else was simple. Not far from her boat, on one of Braavos' hundreds of islands, was a huge draconic head. Its red eyes, like hot coals, stared at her with a mixture of curiosity and disinterest. As a descendant of House Targaryen, there were books that Aegon IV himself, the undeserving, had left for her ancestor. So she knew all about the dragons she had dreamed of riding as a child. Eventually she put those sweet, innocent dreams aside, thinking that dragons no longer existed. But here she was, facing a giant crimson dragon. "Black Pearl, shall we go far away?" Belgier heard one of his servants ask, her voice trembling slightly as her body shook in a storm of cold winds. Belgier made her decision in an instant, looking at her servant and speaking in a sweet, gentle tone. "No, dock on the island. We received such a distinguished guest in Braavos." "Why, yes." The servant's face showed a clear expression of fear and sorrow, but she nodded. Unlike other guests, Belgier personally prepared the drinks, snacks, and the room they would share, even making the bed, thinking she might have a luxurious day today. Something she didn't allow all the men, perhaps of the hundreds of men she danced with, only 3 actually got to share the bed with her. Seeing that everything was as welcoming as possible, Belgier wore a satisfied expression as he felt the boat dock at the island, and a young male voice sounded elegant and polite. "What an honor for me to be received by a distant relative. I must say fate likes to be welcoming sometimes." She turned to see who had entered and discovered that it was the most handsome young man she had ever seen in her life, which was quite surprising considering the number of men she had seen in her life as a courtesan. His hair was white gold, relatively short, falling over his face, silky and shiny, framing a face that could enchant even women who didn't like men. Sharp features, elegant and powerful. His eyes were a deep purple, beautiful, enchanting, and mysterious. His slightly plump lips were curved into a warm and charming smile, with a hint of provocation. Belgier saw that he was tall, very tall, 187 centimeters, 6 feet 1 inch. Black armor, intricately patterned with dragons, hugged a slightly muscular, high-shouldered body. "Your Grace." Belgier placed her hands on her stomach and leaned forward slightly, her sweet, silky voice capable of making men's hearts tremble in the presence of such a beautiful woman. "Call me my prince, I'll be king when my grandmother crowns me," Enar said, looking at the beautiful woman before him. And he had to admit, she was a sight for sore eyes. Belgier is young and lovely, with black hair, light brown skin and full breasts that almost burst out of her yellow silk dress. Her brown eyes were so elegant, gentle, and seductive that they captured the focus that should have been on her body. "My prince." Belgier corrected her words as he gestured to the goose-down pillows carefully placed in front of the table with all manner of drinks and delicacies. Enar nodded and sat down on the cushions. Even in his armor he felt comfortable at this point, he had been riding for hours. Even though the saddle prepared by the Red Faith was extremely comfortable, it was still a journey of hours. Picking up the goblet containing the wine of Myr, Enar drank, breathing a sigh of relief as the sweet taste relaxed his muscles. Belgier joined him as he drank, glancing occasionally at the crimson dragon that slept beneath the normally uninhabited island. "He likes you," Enar commented when he saw that her attention was on Caraxes. He didn't blame her, everyone would focus on Caraxes, after all, he was a beast that could crush a person as easily as an insect. "I'm glad I won't be turned into dragon food." Belgier smiled more sincerely at that moment, cracking a joke that made Enar laugh too. "I haven't introduced myself, forgive my rudeness." Enar spoke, looking at the woman who made the atmosphere more comfortable and hospitable just by her presence and words. "Enar of House Targaryen, first my name, Rider of Caraxes, and other titles I'll have to leave out for now because it's too long." A graceful and genuine laugh escaped Belgier's plump lips, she covered her mouth with her hand and narrowed her eyes in amusement. "Many like to talk about their gigantic titles, my prince does the opposite." "What can I do, I've always been someone who didn't like long titles." Enar smiled and replied in an equally amused and confident tone. "Belgier Otherys, my lord." The Black Pearl of Braavos introduced herself, refilling Enar's wine glass. Her smile was seductive and graceful. The heir to the Iron Throne couldn't help but sigh at how extraordinarily charming this woman was. Truthfully, in his previous life, Enar wouldn't have had the courage to approach and speak to such a beautiful woman as casually as he did now. But in this life, he had gained self-confidence thanks to Queen Rhaenys, who had taught him how to behave and speak in front of women during her etiquette lessons. Without realizing it, Enar and Belgier drank and began to chat, laughter filling the air around them. It wasn't hard to see that they were both enjoying each other's company. However, Enar's next question took Belgier by surprise. "Won't you come back to Westeros with me in the future?" "My prince is very straightforward," Belgier joked in an amused tone. If it had been at the beginning of the conversation, she wouldn't have dared to be so casual and playful, but as it went on she saw that Enar was an amusing, handsome, elegant, and polite young man. He practically embodied what it meant to be a prince in the eyes of every woman in the world. That's why she dared to be so casual and even playful during the conversation. "But I must decline, the court will not be as comfortable as Braavos," Belgier replied with a sigh. It would be a lie to say she wasn't tempted. Being queen was one of the few powerful positions a woman could hold in this world. However, she wasn't suited to court life, especially in Westeros, where she had heard so many conspiracies, deaths, and murders. The young woman was so confident in her appearance that she thought Enar was interested in making her his queen. Enar just shrugged his shoulders when he heard her refusal. It was just a causal idea he had after speaking for Belgier for a while. Although if he had known Belligier's thoughts he would have been speechless. He didn't want to take her as his queen, but as a handmaiden at his side in the future. Seeing that Enar wasn't offended by his refusal, Belgier felt even more at ease with him. Her soft, delicate, and voluptuous body was pressed against his as she gazed at him with a look that would make any man feel extremely flattered. "Where are you going, my lord?" the courtesan asked. "To Volantis to burn tens of thousands of men on horseback," Enar replied, raising the goblet of wine to his lips while holding Belligier's slender, soft waist. Belligier's body tensed for a moment, then relaxed. She wasn't tense from his touch, but from the casualness of killing tens of thousands of people. The young man she was clinging to right now might be as beautiful as poison, but he was actually an aspiring king, a king who wouldn't hesitate to kill tens of thousands. This reminded her not to treat Enar as a young man, but as the powerful and royal man he was. "Do you think Ferrego will come?" Enar asked in a curious tone, not knowing what the woman in his arms was thinking. Belgier recovered from her shock and replied with an equally amused smile. "He's probably coming right now, or he's sending the first sword of Braavos to ask my prince to come to the Sea Lord's palace. Unfortunately for him, it's the others who come to me, not me who goes to them," Enar said, making Belligier's eyes shine with a glow of admiration that was hard to hide. Men liked beautiful women, but women also liked heroes. Chapter 39, The Bastard Daughter of the Valyrian Freehold 2. If you don't know how to handle it, fear will consume your mind, maybe even drive you mad. Like my grandfather Aerys II Targaryen. Enar Targaryen. As Enar and Belgier spoke, Caraxes opened his red eyes and raised his head, noticing the arrival of a small barge approaching where his brother was. "Roar!" A sharp, powerful roar came from his mouth as the dragon's eyes narrowed into a cold, fierce stare. Belgier was startled by the roar and almost jumped, drawing a laugh from Enar. "It's not very polite to laugh at a lady, my lord." Belgier pursed his lips and spoke in a tone of dissatisfaction. Enar just smiled and looked at the barge that came closer and closer until it finally docked at the barge he was on. Soon a man in black leather clothes with medium-length brown hair and green eyes appeared in front of him. He didn't look more than 40 years old. He was an experienced warrior from the way he walked. He had a sword at his waist, but it wasn't a long sword like the ones used in Westeros. It was a shorter, thinner sword. The first sword of Braavos, Caro Valentin. Caro gulped as he saw the red eyes staring at him, cold and fierce. Facing this gigantic creature, he was no different than a child trying to fight an adult. No, worse than that, he was a baby trying to fight an adult. The roar of the beast made him lose all his courage, and he wondered if taming it was really a human's job. He realized why Valyria was the most powerful country on the continent. The first sword turned his gaze to the two people present. Belgier, whom he knew from accompanying the Sea Lord to important feasts, but the other one he had never met and was probably the master of the Crimson Beast. He looked like a pure-blooded Valyrian. His hair seemed to be made of metal, shining like silver and gold, his purple eyes like amethysts. He was tall but young, which worried me even more. Young people have always been the most impulsive in the world. Don't worry, First Sword. He probably won't eat you. Seeing the calm expression on his face, Enar knew that the man was afraid, something normal after looking at Caraxes. He could probably count on his fingers how many people could really stay calm in the face of such a large dragon. Although he knew that the young man wanted to scare him with his words, Caro still tensed at the word, probably. It was a word that could be interpreted in many ways under the current circumstances. In front of you is Enar of House Targaryen, first of his name, rider of Caraxes, and many other titles he prefers not to mention at this time. Belgier introduced Enar with a smile on her lips. Her brown eyes couldn't hide the amusement she felt at the moment. Caro's heart beat faster as he listened to Belagier's presentation, remembering how many times Queen Riella had come to the Sea Lord's palace for help, only to be cruelly ignored and scorned by the noble families of Braavos. Don't be nervous, First Sword. If I saw you with bad intentions, Braavos wouldn't be whole right now. Noticing the nervousness in his eyes, Enar's lips curved into a smile. He sipped his wine and spoke quietly. I would have burned the whole city before you could have reacted properly. Caro felt a chill run through his body at the sight of those eyes, cold and indifferent, and though he smiled, his smile did not reach his eyes. Does your grace have a purpose in Braavos? Caro suppressed the churning in his chest and asked in a calm tone, but anyone could see that he was intimidated by the presence of the young man before him. From the beginning, the course of the conversation was dictated by Enar and no one else. I don't think I owe you any satisfaction, First Sword. Enar replied, narrowing his eyes. I am not your vassal and certainly not the old Sea Lord's. That's what Caro was worried about. What happens when you're young and have the greatest power in the world in your hands? Your Grace, the city of Braavos has its leader, and invading a city for that reason would be a very bad thing for both sides. Before Caro could finish, Enar cut him off. War? He spoke in an amused tone. Or do you think you can threaten me like you threatened Jaehaerys I with the Faceless Men? Caro's face darkened at Enar's words. Of course he knew about the theft of the 3 dragon eggs the Sea Lord had bought hundreds of years ago. I must remind you that the event of that year was resolved peacefully and the Sea Lord paid his debt to the old king at that time. Caro forced a smile and replied, trying to ease the growing tension. Enar didn't have to say anything. Caraxes moved his long neck through the air, his huge head standing next to the barca, the reptilian red eye looking straight at Caro. The crimson dragon bared his sharp teeth as if smiling. A particularly terrifying smile with the dragon's demonic face. A menacing growl came from the dragon. Caro swallowed again, the smell of sulfur and smoke filling the air with a sense of impending destruction. He felt as if he were about to be swallowed and turned into dragon food. But the atmosphere lightened with Enar's next words. But you're right, our differences have indeed been resolved. He said, motioning for the First Sword of Braavos to sit before him. Please sit down. Caraxes let out a guttural sound, expressing his dissatisfaction at not eating a baked treat, and retreated to lie on the floor while he regained his strength. Allow me to decline, Your Grace, but the Sea Lord urgently awaits my return. Caro politely declined with an apologetic expression. Taking a sip of wine, Enar smiled and replied calmly. I will be in Braavos for half a day, feel free to visit me anytime, First Sword or the Lord of the Sea himself. Enar's words made Caro breathe a sigh of relief. Though he had not discovered the young Dragon Lord's purpose, he had at least confirmed that he had not come with ill intentions toward Braavos. Turning to leave, Caro was about to return to the boat he had arrived in, but stopped when he heard the young man's voice again. Tell Ferrago not to interfere with Volantis or the Red Faith again, or I will be forced to act in defense of my followers. Caro's heart began to beat extremely fast. Volantis, the Red Faith, House Targaryen, with this information he was able to form a clear picture of the aspiring king of the Seven Kingdoms' intentions. However, when he heard this, he couldn't help but take a deep breath. He hadn't really expected Prince Enar to have not only a full-grown dragon, but also one of the free cities and the Red Faith behind him. He finally understood why Enar was in Braavos. It wasn't just to rest, it was a warning and a veiled threat. At the same time, he also knew Enar's purpose. He was on his way to Volantis to fight the Dothraki horde. I was surprised to hear you mention some sensitive information of your own. Belgier commented, sounding slightly surprised. Sensitive? No, I just showed him my strength, and if Ferrago is smart, he'll follow my lead. Enar said, bringing the glass of wine to his lips and enjoying the drink once more. Besides, only when there is equal strength can countries begin to negotiate. After all, strength determines everything in the world. Belgeir smiled and found his confidence incredibly charming, as if he knew the future and had prepared for every action in advance. Palace of the Lord of the Sea. Ferrago Anteryon, Sea Lord of Braavos, listened to Caro's words in silence. His deep blue eyes were pensive. His pale, haggard face, as if he were suffering from some illness, wore a serious, dignified expression. How long had it been since he had been so despised? His city was invaded and he could do absolutely nothing, or it would be reduced to ashes by a teenager from some dark, hidden hole in the world. Was this how his ancestors felt when they were under Valeria's rule? That feeling of powerlessness really left a bitter taste. At the same time, the knowledge of his words and of Volantis and the Red Faith made him feel cautious. The unbridled expansion and the creation of a powerful army had made all the free cities wary of Volantis. Braavos was no different. Even now, the Red Faith was spreading through his city like a rampant plague, impossible to control, and all because of a book that told stories he'd never heard before. Caro, I'll send a letter to the court of the Seven Kingdoms. King Baratheon will be happy to know there's a Targaryen with a full-grown dragon. Ferrago spoke as he took a quill, the tip moistened with ink, and began to write on the paper. Won't that make us an enemy of Prince Targaryen? Caro asked worriedly, for unlike the Sea Lord, he had seen the dragon in person. He didn't think the 100-year-old relics could pose any danger to the majestic creature. You are wrong, Caro. He wants me to do this, he wants the prestige and power that comes with it, and there's nothing more prestigious than burning an army of 60,000 men alive. He wants everyone to know of their deeds. Without raising his head, Ferrago replied in a calm tone. Caro remained silent. As Ferrago had said, Enar needed prestige to begin his reconquest. And Prince Targaryen obviously had a very well thought-out plan to create that prestige. Chapter 40, The Second Field of Fire I. The art of war, like any art, is a beautiful thing, and even more full of a sense of accomplishment. A good strategy can work wonders in times of need. Visenya Targaryen, daughter of fire. The first daughter Volantis. Armored, Visenya watched the battle unfold before her. The first war she faced was particularly brutal, arms and guts spilling to the ground as war cries and fear spread across the battlefield like a hellish chorus. To be honest, it wasn't easy to convince her mother to let her go to war, but fortunately Kinvara said she would lead 2,000 men, which reassured the Queen of Westeros, though she still told her to back off if things got out of hand. Something Visenya accepted, for only a fool would fight to the death if he could survive. The Dothraki cavalry is coming. Visenya shouted as he heard one of the soldiers and tightened his grip on his sword and shield. Aim for the horses and then kill anyone who survives the fall. She shouted and her order was passed on man by man. The cavalry arrived in an instant before the heavy infantry of 2,000 men. Visenya saw the moment of impact between the two armies, one of her men flying backwards as a result of the collision between shield and horse. She had no time to worry about the fallen man, for one of the Dothraki had reached her. Visenya was not nervous. As someone who had already killed a few times, she would not be rattled by something like that. Seeing the sword called the horse rapist Sarak, the dragon princess dodged the blade with ease, as it wasn't a large blade like the long swords. Swinging the sword without hesitation, she aimed not at the man but at the animal, cutting off one of the horse's legs with a swift blow, knocking the man to the ground. Visenya saw that she didn't need to kill the man, as the horse had already done the job for her by falling on the man riding it. Turning her gaze forward, she continued to fight the next enemy, always using the strategy of killing the horse first, and then the man riding it. Something that all of the 2,000 men she led followed, becoming a grinder of human and horse flesh. Arrows tore through the air, killing a few unfortunate bystanders, but nothing a shield couldn't handle. 10 minutes later, Visenya took a deep breath, smelling the sickening scent of blood in the air. Her body was exhausted, sticky and tired, but she showed no signs of stopping until she finally noticed the Dothraki horde retreating into the distance. Archbishop Bonero has ordered the troops to retreat, daughter of fire. One of the plate-armored knights approached her and spoke in an equally tired tone. However, his gaze, and that of all those around him, showed clear admiration for the 18-year-old girl. Visenya nodded and withdrew decisively, 5 kilometers from Volantis to a makeshift camp. The war was like waves on a sea, both armies advancing, trying to kill as many of the other as possible, then retreating to catch their breath. After all, they were humans, not immortal beings with infinite endurance. Visenya entered the camp covered in blood, her black armor with the House Targaryen crest stained with blood. It might sound strange, but covered in blood with her hair dyed red and a not-so-pleasant smell on her body, she still felt incredibly aroused. She had trained all her life for this, gone through hardships and long nights, suffered assassination attempts, and swore to herself that she would return all the pain she had suffered in her years of exile. How could she not be happy at this moment, finally able to put everything she had learned into practice? Looking around the camp, Visenya noticed that the wounded were arriving in small numbers, and the more seriously injured in even smaller numbers. This made her realize that the difference in equipment was something extremely important in a war. The Dothraki had no armor, and their swords, called arak, could not easily penetrate the steel plates of armor. Bows had power and were the main strength of the Dothraki cavalry, but while bows could be powerful, they had limited arrows, and even the best archer in the world couldn't claim to hit 100% of the arrows he shot. It could be said that the war was moving toward victory for Volantis. She wanted it to happen before her nephew arrived, to show that even without a dragon, she wasn't a fragile girl and definitely wouldn't be a burden. As for the dead, honestly, she wasn't worried about that. She had discovered that death was just a common thing in the Red Faith. Many could be revived by the Red Priestesses with magic she didn't know about at the moment. And while it wasn't 100% certain that they would revive, most of them did. Although it wasn't an army of immortals, it was extremely powerful, so much so that even with twice the number of enemies, the Red Army still had extremely high morale. Visenya walked with her head held high as she headed towards the main tent. Entering it, she saw Archbishop Bonero and many other men, some Red Priestesses and former slaves, now servants. Seeing Visenya's arrival, Bonero nodded to her and looked at her delicate face with sweet features covered in blood and hair stuck to her face. According to the information he had received, Princess Visenya really surprised him. The girl was truly worthy of the title of Daughter of Fire, fighting with a voracious and destructive flame on the battlefield. "How is the war going, Archbishop?" Visenya asked, taking a seat on one of the chairs in her heavy armor. She accepted a goblet of water from a servant and drank unceremoniously. "Very well, the moats and stakes served very well to stop the advance of the Dothraki cavalry," Bonero said with a rare smile. The idea of using the moats and wooden stakes came from Visenya herself after she saw the flat land around the city. "Though the count is still uncertain, we killed about 1,500 Dothraki in exchange for 200 of our soldiers," Bonero continued. "But we only killed 300 on the southern front." Visenya's face showed a calm expression. The strategy with the Dothraki had worked better than she had expected, but the situation on the southern front was a problem. The Dothraki were not alone. There was a mercenary army of 11,000 fighting in the south at the moment. And unlike the Dothraki, they were not as emotional and fearless as the Dothraki, who advanced knowing they would die. Fortunately, the two armies didn't join forces for more than obvious reasons. Though the 35,000-strong force had to be divided into two battlefronts, the Red Army still held the upper hand for the moment. "What about the secondary plan?" Visenya asked, wiping some of the blood from her cheeks, feeling more energetic after a brief rest. Bonero's plan, of which Visenya spoke, was to lure Khal Drogo and his army away from Volantis with a secondary, weaker and less numerous army. In the meantime, the Dothraki forces that remained on the outskirts of Volantis would be wiped out. Once these forces were eliminated, the main army would pursue the main Dothraki contingent. The secondary army would then turn and face Khal Drogo's forces directly, while the main Red Army would approach to attack the Dothraki from the rear. This strategy would pressure the enemy from both the front and the rear, ensuring their complete destruction. After all, as any strategist knows, to be attacked from the rear is practically synonymous with defeat in battle. "We'll start in 2 hours, everyone can eat and come back fully rested," Bonero said, making everyone stand up and leave the main tent. Visenya was no exception. She walked over to her tent, entered it and sighed with relief as she tried to remove her armor by herself. However, a pair of small hands appeared behind her and helped her remove her battle armor. With a helpless sigh, Visenya didn't bother to turn around to see who it was and just spoke. "Does our mother know?" Daenerys smiled innocently and replied, unbuckling her armor. "She thinks I'm asleep after studying for so long." The strong smell of blood on the armor didn't bother her, and she continued to help her sister with an admiring look. "How was it, Vi? I mean the battlefield?" Daenerys asked, removing her armor and gambeson completely, leaving the 18-year-old naked. Daenerys quickly pulled Visenya over to a barrel of water, and the young woman needed no help getting into the barrel. Visenya let out a pleasant moan as she submerged herself in the barrel, wrapped her arms around the barrel and closed her eyes. War was cool, but it was too exhausting. "I'd say it's brutal, especially one like this. It's a good time to prepare for the future in Westeros, where more wars await us," Visenya commented with her eyes closed as she felt her younger sister wipe her face and hair like a wet cloth. "Unfortunately, I'm too young to go to war," Daenerys commented with a tone of dissatisfaction at her mother's words. She had taken a man's life before, but she was too young to go to war. Honestly, she wanted to call her mother a hypocrite, but with the respect she had for the woman who raised her, she wouldn't allow herself to do so. "Don't worry, Dany, your only responsibility is to hatch the eggs our nephew asked you to," Visenya comforted her sister in a soft, warm tone. Daenerys' eyes lit up when she heard this. The night before she had dreamed of blood and fire, a dream she remembered in detail. She assumed she had seen a clue to finding the source to hatch her lovely dragons from their eggs. "I will hatch them, sister," Daenerys spoke in a determined tone. Chapter 41, The Second Field of Fire 2. Fire and blood, they said, and that's what fell on the Dothraki army. It fell from the sky like the wrath of the gods. Varys spoke to the small council. Drogo, mounted on the largest and strongest horse in the Khalasar, watched the advancing and retreating armies with a cold, calm gaze. No matter how many of his soldiers died before him, he and all the others showed nothing but indifference to such deaths. It wasn't that they didn't feel anything, but in their eyes the dead Dothraki rode the fire horses, stars, across the night sky with the horse god. How could they be sad in the face of such an honorable and glorious destiny as riding beside their god on horses of pure fire? Suddenly Drogo's eyes caught sight of at least half of the army breaking away from the main body and heading away from the great city. His first thought was that the enemy had become frightened and fled the battle. It was a thought that made him proud, but the second thought that crossed his mind was that the enemy had begun to set a trap. "Blood of my blood, what are your orders?" Drogo heard his blood rider, Kohalo, ask with a calm and respectful expression. Drogo remained silent and looked at the men on horseback around him. He could see that they all wanted to hunt down the cowards and weaklings and kill them all. What if Drogo refused? He knew that he would be considered even weaker and more of a coward for not pursuing the fleeing enemy. Drogo made his decision in an instant, looked at everyone and spoke in a strong, unquestioning tone. "Pursue and kill the cowards in armor." Even if it was a trap, he, Khal Drogo, the Khal of the greatest Khalasar of his time, would still emerge victorious in the face of these cowardly and weak tactics. Shouts of joy and ferocity were heard as soon as everyone heard his Khal's decision. On the other side of the battlefield, Visenya watched half of the enemy army scatter and couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. Though the chances were slim, she and Banero were still slightly worried that Khal Drogo might not do as they had planned. In the end, the strategy worked with an ease that surprised them. Arrogance and extreme self-confidence made one of the most powerful men in Essos fall into their traps with little difficulty. In the future, beware of pent-up arrogance. On the battlefield, only calm and wisdom can bring you victory. Visenya muttered to herself, learning every moment of this war. The problems and doubts she had when reading the books disappeared with every moment she took part in the war. That's the difference between a rookie and a veteran that was written in the books. She looked at the army of barbarians half her size and smiled. With the first part of her plan in the accomplished, all Visenya had to do was complete the second and run quickly to catch up with the allied army. Using her shield to block an arrow, Visenya advanced with her sword in hand, fighting like a valkyrie on the battlefield. Her sword was fast and deadly, her steps erratic and hard to predict, and surprisingly she didn't mind playing dirty, using dust to blind her enemies or even kicking certain men in their most vulnerable parts. As a woman, she knew she could never match a man in strength and endurance, but she could make up for it with her speed and agility. Visenya simply used her strengths, augmented by the terrain and tactics that were unethical in the eyes of many of the lords and knights of Westeros. But did she care? The answer was no. One of the first things she learned from the books was that generals should use every tactic to defeat their enemies. The truth was always written by the victors and remembered by the people as their legacy. Wrong or not, it was necessary. Visenya plunged her sword into the neck of a Dothraki, snapping his throat and then kicking him in the stomach, knocking him to the ground. The man tried to stop the bleeding by placing his own hands on his throat, but it was a futile attempt as blood continued to pour from the wound. Visenya watched coldly as the life drained from his eyes, feeling nothing but indifference. She wouldn't feel sorry for her enemies, because her fate would be the same if it was the other way around, and maybe even worse because she was a woman. She didn't care about anything else as she moved forward, concentrating on killing the enemies in front of her. The 2,000 men around her protected her flanks, allowing Visenya to concentrate on what was in front of her while giving orders to her men. In the makeshift camp, nearly 12-year-old Daenerys could hear the war cries and the clash of metal from afar, but she didn't mind the noise, helping the Red Priestess bandage the wounded soldiers and sew up the cuts with needle and thread. Her blue dress was stained with blood around her belly. The girl's delicate face also bore traces of blood, especially on her cheeks, obviously none of her own, but that of the wounded. Helping others was the only thing she could do at the moment, as she couldn't take part in the war. The princess is very good at sewing wounds. Is she used to sewing or weaving? The Red Priestess commented with an expression of slight admiration as she watched Daenerys' skillful movements as she sewed the soldiers' wounds. Sewing, Daenerys replied, running the needle through the soldier's skin and joining it to the other piece of skin. I was always the one who mended my mother's and sister's clothes while they were busy studying or working in taverns to make ends meet without attracting the attention of assassins or bad people. The Red Priest nodded and smiled. And you, what's your story? Daenerys asked without lifting her head, concentrating on stitching up the wounds of the soldier lying before her. Me? Just another harlot's daughter in Myr with no idea who my father was, a powerful lord or a commoner lucky enough to lie with my beautiful mother. The priestess commented with a smile. Because my mother didn't want me to suffer the same fate as her, she sold me to the Red Temple, where I became a priestess. Frankly, the woman's story didn't surprise Daenerys. It was something so common in Essos that you'd be surprised how rotten the human race could be. Daenerys asked no more questions, and when she had almost finished stitching the man up, she heard footsteps behind her, then a voice that sent shivers down her spine. Daenerys Targaryen, it seems you've gained a lot of courage lately, to the point of ignoring my orders and treating my concerns as nothing. Her hands covered in blood, Daenerys swallowed and turned to see the graceful figure of her mother standing before her. Her expression could be described as calm, but the girl knew that calm was the one thing that wasn't there. It was a silent rage, ready to explode at the slightest moment of carelessness. Mummy, you look so beautiful in that red dress, so beautiful that you could make the moon shine before you. Kind and intelligent words fell from the lips of the nearly 12-year-old girl in an instant, causing the Red Priestess to let out a melodious laugh. Even the man being stitched up smiled despite the pain he felt at the moment. Your Grace, don't blame the princess, she has a kind heart and only wanted to help wounded men like me. The man spoke, trying to soothe the queen's anger. He was already flattered to have someone like Daenerys tend to his wounds. It was the least he could do to spare one of his rescuers a scolding from her mother. Riella might have believed the man's words had she not known her youngest daughter. Had she not threatened, she knew full well that Daenerys would have rushed to the battlefield to fight alongside her sister without hesitation. Just as the Queen Mother was about to speak, the sound of something distant caught her attention. It was a long, guttural sound, accompanied by the thunder of wings flapping. It wasn't just Riella who heard it, everyone in the camp raised their heads to see a small dot on the horizon approaching. The confused expressions on the faces of the people soon turned to pure shock, while others showed fanaticism. The Red Priestess, seeing what was coming, couldn't help but mutter to herself, remembering a verse from the Bible. Behold, he shall come, riding on a crimson beast, with the sword of light in his right hand. O Son of Light, his splendor shall fill the heavens, and at his coming he shall bring everlasting peace and abundant prosperity to the whole earth. Chapter 42, The Second Field of Fire 3. What did it feel like to incinerate an entire army? Just the horrible smell of burning human flesh filling the air, but at the same time an overwhelming feeling of absolute power, as if I were the most powerful man in the world. It's hard to describe exactly, but if I had to explain it, I'd say it was like wishing for the moon and believing I could hold it in my hands. Enar Targaryen, riding Caraxes for the first time at the Battle of Volantis. Roar! A thunderous roar rang out in the sky as the gigantic Caraxes seemed to cover the heavens with its wings above them. Riella watched in utter disbelief as the giant crimson dragon swooped overhead, bringing with it winds and the smell of sulfur that for some reason reminded her of dragonstone. She didn't know how to describe the feeling she had when she saw the dragon. It was as if a long-cherished dream had come true. The dream of the Targaryen kings over the centuries was coming true before her eyes, just as it had been her dream after more than a decade in exile. If House Targaryen had dragons, would the noble houses have the courage to rebel? The answer was a resounding no. Harrenhal Castle stood as proof of the power of House Targaryen's dragons. What fool would dare fight a dragon that could incinerate an entire city in minutes? And though she knew of the dragon's existence from Kinvara, knowing of the dragon's existence and seeing it in person were two very different things. Riella had to admit it was spectacular to see. She really wanted to know what it felt like to ride a dragon. She assumed it would be liberating. It was a creature capable of killing millions of people in a city, but she felt absolutely safe seeing it up close. Riella tried to see her grandson, but she couldn't see him clearly, catching a glimpse of white gold hair before the dragon was hundreds of yards away in the blink of an eye. Daenerys could only open her mouth in awe as she watched the huge crimson dragon soar above the camp. She was sure she would never forget the scene before her. She would always remember her nephew arriving to save them, just as he had a year and a half ago, when he managed to find a safe home for his family even on another continent. "Mummy, let's see," Daenerys said in an excited tone as she watched the crimson figure quickly disappear from her field of vision. Riella wore a struggling expression but finally nodded. She wanted to see her grandson as soon as possible, even if she saw him burning tens of thousands of people. "Come on, I've come with a horse and we can head for the battlefield," she said, taking her daughter's hand and dragging her along, despite the blood on Daenerys' hands, dress and face. The Red Priestess and all the wounded didn't care about their own injuries and all forced themselves to get up and head towards the battlefield. Although many had relatively serious injuries, absolutely no one wanted to miss the chance to see the Son of Light up close. Unlike Riella and Daenerys, who had admiration and joy in their eyes, the members of the Red Faith had only one thing: fanaticism and nothing else. On the battlefield there was not a spot without a trace of blood on Visenya's body. The 18-year-old was completely drenched in blood, and yet she showed a satisfied smile. In that first shockwave, the attack of 11,000 men against 25,000 Dothraki went very well, and despite the relatively high casualties, they managed to kill at least almost 10,000 enemies. The number was so great because instead of swords, Visenya chose to use long spears to deal with the Dothraki cavalry. The spear barrier became particularly nightmarish for the Dothraki, who were unable to advance with their horses and had to fight on the ground like everyone else. Without the advantage of their horses' high mobility, the Dothraki, who couldn't get through the armor or get close to the Red Army because of the long spears, basically became targets to be shot at. Visenya was sure that, given a little more time, she could destroy the remaining 15,000 Dothraki still alive and exhausted at that moment. However, she soon discovered that she couldn't fulfill her dream of winning a legendary battle. The reason she couldn't was simple: the sky darkened and the thunderous sound of flapping wings caught the attention of everyone on the battlefield. Everyone looked up and panicked, or rather, the Dothraki for the first time showed expressions of fear and terror at being obscured by the gigantic wings. "Nephew," Visenya murmured, watching the greatest power in the world flying above her. The dragon was a deep shade of red-crimson, its size was breathtaking, it was practically a small flying hill. At the same time, a look of admiration shone in her violet eyes. She absolutely idolized the strong, especially a man who had a dragon as his nephew, who was not only intelligent, but also worthy of sitting on the Iron Throne. Seeing the dragon opening its mouth, Visenya opened her arms and muttered, "Fire and blood." The moment she muttered this, crimson flames gushed out of the dragon's mouth and descended upon the earth like an overwhelming funnel of flames, hitting the Dothraki. A moment before, Enar looked at the Dothraki army and showed no mercy in his actions. "Dracarys." Caraxes obeyed his brother's request and crimson flames fell on the Dothraki army as the crimson dragon flew above them. The flames consumed everything in front of them, be it men or horses, all of whom were reduced to mere ashes in an instant. What was left of these men was often only their feet, which were not hit so surely by the dragon's flames. Enar tilted his body to the side and Caraxes followed his movements, flying vertically in the air, circling the battlefield as the crimson dragon opened its mouth and spewed red flames at the Dothraki army. Wherever the flames touched, they left a trail in a straight line on the scorched earth blackened by the flames. Caraxes located a group slightly larger than ants and glided into the air, standing in a position in the air while flapping his wings. He opened his mouth and flames poured from his throat in a straight line, consuming all the enemies before him in an instant. After that, Caraxes landed on the ground with a loud and heavy thud. Without noticing, he crushed a Dothraki along with his horse with his paw and continued to burn anything that moved. The dragon's long tail didn't stand still, acting like a whip, killing anyone who dared approach it. The arrows shot at him didn't even scratch the scales hardened by the extreme heat of Caraxes' body. They didn't even tear the membrane of his wings, and all the arrows were shot far away. Enar looked at the entire battlefield now covered in red flames and couldn't help but take a deep breath. The disgusting smell of human flesh floated around him along with the ashes of the dead. At that moment, even though he didn't want to, he felt like the king of the world. How could he not? Perhaps this was every boy's dream, and here he was, killing tens of thousands of men in less than 5 minutes. Enar didn't enjoy this feeling for long. He commanded Caraxes and continued to kill everyone on the ground while the dragon's heavy footsteps echoed hundreds of meters away. From the saddle, Enar could see Caraxes' huge neck and his face changing direction every time he killed a Dothraki. There was something faintly resembling a sadistic smile on the dragon's draconic face. Through their bond, Prince Targaryen could feel Caraxes' extreme joy and sadism as if it were his own. It also brought Enar a feeling of happiness. It was the first time they had both acted so freely since they were born. How could they not be happy at this moment? Visenya, who gazed at the dragon amid the blood-red flames, spitting out even more red flames, had nothing but pure admiration and a longing to possess such power one day in her lilac eyes. At the same time, her eyes fell on the saddle, where even from hundreds of meters away, she could see the white gold hair and black armor along with a red cloak over his shoulders. Even though she was disappointed at not being able to destroy the entire Dothraki army, she was still incredibly happy to see the figure riding the dragon. It was her nephew, Prince Enar of House Targaryen. Chapter 43, The Second Field of Fire 4. A fair duel for killing all his troops. Think of it as a bit of mercy for such a skilled leader. Enar Targaryen, remembering the fight with Khal Drogo, the greatest Khal of his time. Sister. As Visenya looked at Caraxes and Enar, she heard an incomparably familiar cry. She looked back and saw a galloping horse rapidly approaching on the battlefield, dodging the bodies of the dead men and horses. She immediately recognized her mother and sister. Looking at the state of her daughter wearing armor and covered in blood, Riella couldn't help but let out a helpless sigh. Apart from her grandson, would anyone really marry her daughter? Yes, she planned to marry her daughter to her grandson, not just Visenya but Daenerys too. The likely birth of the dragons was the main reason for her taking such a drastic decision. She would in no way allow the scenario that happened at the Dance of the Dragons to happen again. Only House Targaryen could have dragons and no one else. Only a united family could bring her back all that her ancestors had conquered before her. However, she put these thoughts aside and focused on the scene happening in front of her and truly understood why Aegon and his sisters/wives had managed to bring a continent to its knees before House Targaryen. The scene of one person and a dragon destroying an entire army was truly a sight for sore eyes. Such a sight might not be so rare in modern times where there were nuclear bombs, but in the world of Planetos it was a truly shocking sight, especially after the fall of ancient Valyria and the disappearance of the dragons. He's flying again. Daenerys exclaimed in regret for not knowing her sweet nephew, her lilac eyes staring at the crimson dragon taking flight and heading in the opposite direction of Volantis city. Visenya and Riella also looked regretful, but they didn't stay that way for long, especially Visenya, who was one of the generals on the battlefield. "Forward troops!" she shouted, and her orders were passed on in less than 5 minutes. Although Benero's strategy couldn't be completed because of her nephew, she still wanted to see him incinerate all the enemy Dothraki. The troops advanced on Visenya's orders without any hesitation, something impossible to happen before this war took place, but it became possible when everyone saw how she fought alongside them regardless of her special status. Riella's eyes widened seeing this. For the first time in almost 20 years, she noticed that her daughter was no longer a frightened little girl always seeking refuge in her arms on stormy nights, but had become a powerful woman who could command tens of thousands of men. "Mother, let's follow Visenya." Riella awoke from her stupor at her youngest daughter's words, nodding as she grabbed the reins of her horse and followed the army, passing through the field of fire before her, the red flames still burning faintly on the ground along with the ashes of the dead. Enar didn't know that his family was watching him as he flew with Caraxes towards the second enemy army miles away. Honestly, such a strategy was really suitable to fight these Dothraki, but only if you had a powerful army, otherwise splitting your troops wasn't a very smart strategy on the battlefield. 5 minutes later, Enar saw two armies clashing, excited shouts full of savagery could be heard from afar, and even if he didn't know anything, he could assume it was the Dothraki. There was no other ethnic group in the world as warlike as the Dothraki. Bonero, who wore red and gold armor, held a hammer covered in flames as he killed everyone with ease. The warhammer sank into his enemies' chests and then smashed their heads, exploding them like Melanikas, spilling blood and brain tissue everywhere. His face was calm, but everyone could see the happiness in his eyes. The reason for his happiness was very simple: the cloud of smoke rising into the sky could be seen from miles away. It didn't take a genius to know who had arrived and probably destroyed the second Dothraki army. "To the Son of Light!" Bonero shouted, causing everyone around him to shout at the same time. "To the Son of Light! For the Son of Light! To the Son of Light!" The morale of the army soared even higher at that moment, the soldiers seeming to have used Pervidin as they advanced with a confidence and fearlessness of death that shocked even the Dothraki, as if it were the first time they had seen someone braver than themselves. Both armies stopped, however, when they noticed that the sky had gone completely dark. Everyone looked up and grew pale in front of the gigantic creature in the sky. The creature's demonic grin was particularly terrifying, and flames spewed from its mouth, falling upon the Dothraki like the wrath of the gods. The Red Army retreated to avoid the dragon's flames and watched in utter fanaticism as a story from the Bible unfolded before them. Enar didn't care about the Red Army and focused on the Dothraki army, killing as many as he could in as little time as possible. Caraxes flew extremely low as his mouth spewed red flames that turned everything in front of him to ash. As he rode around the battlefield, Enar's quick eyes caught sight of a small group of interesting Dothraki, because unlike the others, this small group looked at him and Caraxes without any fear. The leader of the small group, who was mounted on the largest and strongest horse, looked directly at him. "Khal Drogo." A whisper escaped Enar's lips, guessing his identity in an instant. The things this man would do to his family made fury bubble up in his chest. Sensing Enar's rage, Caraxes let out an equally furious roar and suddenly changed direction in the air, his huge body having no trouble doing such a maneuver in the air. Without any hesitation on Caraxes' part, blood-red flames poured out of his mouth, trying to incinerate the ants that had dared to make his brother angry. However, unlike what he had expected, the ants seemed to be prepared and quickly fled the scene. Suddenly, Enar, who was paying attention to Khal Drogo, reached forward and grabbed the arrow, which would have hit him in the eye if he hadn't held it. "Caraxes, get down." Enar spoke in High Valyrian and Caraxes obeyed, landing 100 meters from Khal Drogo and his blood riders. Enar descended from Caraxes through the iron net and fell to the ground with both feet on the ground. He drew both swords, wielding them in both hands. Lady Lya and Dark Sister came out of their sheaths with a sharp, cutting sound. Looking around, the crimson fire still burned around him, creating almost a fighting ring made of dragon fire. Enar didn't need to say anything, his actions practically said what he wanted. As he had imagined, Khal Drogo rode his horse through the red flames in an instant. He got off his horse and drew his arak, his brown, almost black eyes fixed on the man who had destroyed his Khalasar, riding a huge fire horse with a calm gaze. "I will bathe in your blood and your head will be one of my trophies." Drogo spoke, but in his own language, something Enar understood because he knew his own. "Your head will also be a great trophy. I'll give it to the dogs. Something like that is worthy for the scum that you and your people are." Enar replied in the same language as Drogo, not hiding his contempt, disdain and disgust at the Dothraki's actions. Not only were his people despised, but so was he. Drogo felt a violent flare of anger in his chest hearing the boy's words. He had never been so despised since he was born. Drogo wasted no more time. He advanced with his arak. He quickly covered the distance of 100 meters in less than 10 seconds. Clang! Khal Drogo's blade was blocked by Lady Lya's. Sparks blossomed as the two blades met. Enar felt his arms tremble slightly at the impact of the two swords. Although he despised the customs of the Dothraki, he had to admit that the man in front of him was extremely strong. The Targaryen prince didn't remain in a bladed stalemate for long. In his other hand, Dark Sister made a horizontal move, attacking the Khal without any hesitation in her actions. Drogo sidestepped by moving his body to the side and attacked with surprising agility, causing Enar to use Lady Lya to block the Khal's attack once again. Enar didn't back down and thrust his sword forward with force and suddenly kicked Drogo in the stomach with his leg covered by the plate armor. A grunt escaped the Khal's lips, but the man didn't flinch despite the blow, nor did Enar. Both engaged in a wild exchange of swords and blows amidst the sea of fire around them. Chapter 44, The Second Field of Fire v. Having a family together is difficult, but when you have one, you finally realize how lucky you are. Enar thought as he looked at the three women in front of him. Clang! 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 The sound of swords seemed to echo across the battlefield. What was left of the Dothraki army watched in silence as their leader dueled in the middle of the sea of fire and blood. The same was happening with the Red Army, all of whom watched the Son of Light fight with a fanatical gaze. It was the first time they had all seen him, and what they saw satisfied all their imaginations of how the Son of Light would appear. It was everything they had hoped for and more. Not long afterwards, the army led by Visenya arrived and joined the army led by Bonero. The Red Archbishop, Bonero, looked at the girl covered in blood and nodded in respect. "It seems that our plan cannot be successfully completed, Princess." Even as he said this, there was no sense of regret on his face. On the contrary, there was a gentle, warm smile on his lips. How could he be unhappy at finally meeting his Messiah and the whole religion of the Red Faith? Visenya was smiling too, her eyes fixed on the two figures fighting in the sea of crimson fire with a look of adoration in her violet eyes. Fast, strong, and brutal. The exchange of swords was so intense that the first to make the slightest mistake would be mortally wounded. The sound of metal colliding and the sparks in the air in the sea of fire seemed like a scene straight out of the epic tales of the Age of Heroes. Incredible! Daenerys, riding with her mother on the horse, couldn't help but exclaim aloud, her lilac eyes widening at the sight of the epic struggle before her. "Kill him, nephew!" Daenerys shouted loudly, so much to encourage her sweet nephew in this deadly fight. Riella looked at her daughter and couldn't help but let out another helpless sigh. Although she loved her daughters, she sometimes felt that Rhaegar was more restrained than her daughters. Enar, who was fighting Drogo, heard the girl's excited voice and couldn't help but flash a gentle smile. "Looks like I'll have to make an effort not to disappoint my little aunt," Enar thought as he became even more aggressive in his attacks. If before his attacks had been swift and brutal, now they became insidious and extremely fast, always aiming at an angle that was difficult to defend against, to the point where only the light escaping in the air could prove that he was attacking. And even more surprising was Drogo, who could keep up with his attacks with his wealth of fighting experience. The two swords tore through the air at high speed as they clashed violently against Drogo's arak. However, unlike Enar's swords, which were made of Valyrian steel and star steel, Drogo's sword was far from being able to withstand so many blows from such tough and sharp swords. Then, before Enar's unsurprised eyes, Drogo's arak collided violently with Lady Lya once again, shattering into dozens of pieces before Drogo's eyes. The Dark Sister seized the moment and slashed at Drogo's shoulder, tearing through flesh and bone as if she were slicing butter. It left a 20-inch gash from his shoulder to his stomach. His organs were visible through the wound as blood gushed from it. Drogo calmly looked at the wound and ignored it as he advanced on Enar, trying to knock him to the ground, but foreseeing the future with his prescience, the Targaryen prince calmly backed away as he saw the man trying to approach him with his internal organs protruding from his body. Drogo couldn't take 3 steps forward and fell to his knees, breathing heavily, blood staining his body in large quantities. He raised his head and looked with difficulty at the young man approaching him with 2 swords, one in each hand. "I'm not saying I'll remember you as a worthy man, but I will remember you as a warrior." Enar spoke calmly as the 2 swords touched Drogo's neck in the shape of scissors. Drogo showed nothing but calm and spat on Enar's black armor. Enar narrowed his eyes and moved both swords at the same time, cutting off Drogo's head. His head fell as his body remained kneeling on the ground before him. Grabbing his head by the hair, Enar raised his head to the sky as a tsunami of excited, joyous shouts rang out around him. It was the Red Army, shouting and screaming in celebration of their great victory. Suddenly, Enar heard the sound of approaching horses and saw Drogo's blood riders approaching rapidly on horseback, a rack in hand. The Targaryen prince was not surprised by the blood riders' actions. He knew their ways and understood that they would all die for their call. Before Enar could do anything, Caraxes snaked around him, protecting him, and opened his mouth full of huge teeth. Deep in his throat, flames could be seen building up before spewing out of his mouth in a funnel of extremely hot, destructive flames. All of Drogo's blood riders were consumed and turned to ashes in a matter of seconds under the dragon's red flames. Enar let out a sigh, knowing it was all over and he could relax for a moment. He looked at the head in his hand and placed it on the ground in front of Drogo's kneeling body, muttering to himself, "Burn in hell with your sins, Lord of Horses." Looking at the flames that had almost ceased to exist, Enar raised his sword and spoke loudly. "You have orders? Seek out and destroy all enemies." Enar shouted loudly, his voice spreading through the surroundings with a powerful, regal tone. What followed was a tsunami of deafening voices. "Yes, prophet." With their shout, the Red Army advanced towards the remnants of the Dothraki. They had only one objective, to complete the first order given by the Son of Light. Enar smiled gently and stroked Caraxes' neck, feeling incredibly satisfied with what they had just done. Although Jon Snow was free, he was, after all, just another insignificant piece in this unchanging world before the powers of the gods. He, Enar Targaryen, was different. He would break the wheel of fate and make this world move forward again. He would become a god to these people and make the human race survive until his last day. Tyrant, despot, or monster, he wouldn't do right or wrong. He would do what was necessary. Caraxes let out a comfortable guttural sound and lay down on the ground while staring at Enar with his gigantic red eyes, which resembled hot coals. Just like his knight, there was a sense of pleasure and satisfaction in his eyes. It was the first time that Caraxes could finally unleash his true warlike and sadistic nature. So like Enar, the Crimson Dragon was as incredibly relaxed at this moment as he had ever been. Suddenly, Enar heard two horses approaching and turned while still stroking the scales on Caraxes' neck. In front of him appeared three women riding two horses. Enar let out a sigh and smiled warmly. "Looks like it's the first time we've met in person." Enar spoke with a joking tone, but before he could notice, there was someone in front of him. She was a relatively tall woman, but not very tall, barely reaching his chest, and she had the characteristic hair and eyes of House Targaryen. Her lilac eyes gazed at him with a look of emotion and with tears already welling up in her eyes. "You look so much like your father," Riella said, reaching out and grasping her grandson's face with both hands. Even though she didn't want to cry, she found herself feeling the tears slide down her cheeks. Without hesitation, she didn't wait for Enar's response and hugged him tightly, resting her head on his cold armor-covered chest, despite feeling nothing but warmth and security. She just wanted to embrace her son's legacy right now. Enar blinked and hesitated, but stroked her hair affectionately. "Sorry I'm late, dear grandmother." Enar spoke with a slightly guilty tone. If he had arrived faster, the fights that had already taken place wouldn't have needed to happen. "No matter, I'm glad you're safe and healthy," Riella replied, wiping the tears from her eyes. For her, there was nothing happier than her family being safe and healthy. Chapter 45. The family finally reunited. Being treated like a god is definitely strange. Everyone asks you to fulfill their wishes, as if I'm going to fulfill them. Enar Targaryen thought as he was surrounded by worshippers. Essos Volantis, the first daughter. Enar was preparing to break his daily fast when he heard someone knocking on his door. Seeing in the mirror that there was no flaw in his clothes, he answered, "Come in." As soon as his words sounded, the door was opened and a platinum-haired woman entered the room with a very happy expression. "Grandmother." Enar greeted the woman with a warm smile on his face. Riella couldn't help looking at her grandson and smiled even more. If she hadn't known that her grandson was the same age as her youngest daughter, she could easily have mistaken him for a young adult of 16 or 17. He was very tall, measuring around 186 centimeters in height, 6 feet 1 inch, his slightly muscular body visible through the baggy red tunic he was wearing at the moment, which sported a cleavage at the chest, showing off a defined and streamlined abdomen. He was just the right amount of muscular not to have extremely bulging muscles. As for his face, there was nothing to talk about. As the son of the man considered the most handsome in Westeros, Enar's face was simply too beautiful. Riella was sure that his looks alone could be the dream of many a lattice still single or even married in Westeros. Are you feeling well? Have you rested well? Riella asked with a worried tone as she searched for any trace of exhaustion from the battle that had taken place the day before. Even now, the town was still noisy, everyone discussing the battle that had begun to be referred to as the Second Field of Fire. Riella thought it was a very apt name, especially thinking about how many had died the night before, ashes falling from the sky like raindrops. Faced with his grandmother's concern, Enar replied in an amused tone. Don't worry, the biggest job was done by my brother Caraxes. Riella couldn't help but notice the term used to refer to the dragon, proving that her grandson and the dragon shared a very strong bond and considered each other brothers. This brought a smile to her lips. Would you like to walk with me? I'll go see Caraxes and then we'll break our fast together. Enar said, inviting Riella to walk with him, something Riella accepted without a second thought. She wanted to learn as much about Enar as possible, to at least try to make up for lost time between them. As she walked through the corridors towards the outermost part of the great temple, Riella noticed something that she found very worrying. When everyone looked at Enar, they weren't looking at a king, but at a god, a look of worship and reverence. Even the guards following them looked as if they would give their lives for her grandson at any second. Riella's fears were realized when a mother approached holding her daughter. Can the Messiah bless my daughter? The mother asked, showing her daughter, who was no more than a few years old. Enar wasn't surprised and held the girl with a gentle smile and kissed her forehead. God bless her, she will be a strong and healthy child. The woman smiled, took her daughter and bowed, then walked away with a broad smile on her face. After the woman, others began to gather around Enar. All members of the Red Faith, all trying to touch him or ask for a blessing. At one point, Riella felt trapped and suffocated by the amount of people gathering around them. Fortunately, this only lasted a few moments before the guards surrounded her and her grandson, forming a protective ring around them. Looking at Enar's perfectly normal face, Riella couldn't imagine how her grandson could remain perfectly normal in the face of such an absurd scene. It wasn't that Enar minded such things, but scenes like this would be very normal in the future, especially in Essos, less so in Westeros, but even more so when the long night came. He was the spiritual pillar of the people and would have to get used to many treating him as a godlike figure. Under the protection of dozens of guards, Enar and Riella finally managed to leave the great temple. Are you okay? Don't you feel uncomfortable? Riella asked with an unreadable expression on her face. Though she had realized it before, living in the Great Temple for nearly 2 years had only confirmed her earlier suspicions that the entire Red Faith had its core in her grandson. How this was possible or even how it happened, she had no idea. It was so crazy and unreal that Riella wondered if all these people were mad. I'll get used to it, Enar replied with a smile on his face, but Riella could tell that he carried a responsibility that she didn't know how many times heavier than her own. The walk to the training ground where Caraxes lay was quiet, there weren't many people around, and those who were there were kept at bay by the Red Guards. Riella listened with pleasure to Enar's childhood story, regretting that a Targaryen prince had been raised as a bastard. When she heard how Enar was treated by Catelyn, a rage bubbled up in her chest. If there was one thing it was someone who protected her family. When she returned to Westeros, she would make that woman suffer a little. But she wouldn't kill her because she was the wife of the Lord Paramount of the North, who was now an ally of House Targaryen. Riella's expression didn't escape Enar's eyes, and he felt his heart warm to see her act with such fury at the way he was being treated by Catelyn Stark. When Enar and Riella were close to the training field, they both saw 2 small figures spying on the gigantic dragon from behind a pillar. Getting closer to the 2 figures, Enar and Riella overheard their conversation. I want to fly on it, the platinum-haired girl commented with a tone full of longing. What if the princess falls? It doesn't seem very safe. The second girl commented with a worried tone. Don't be a coward, Missandei. Imagine how cool it is to fly on a dragon. The platinum-haired girl retorted to the other girl's words. I don't see how flying on a dragon is cool, it looks like it's going to eat me at any moment. Missandei replied, looking at the gigantic beast that had burned tens of thousands of people alive in less than an hour. Riella stroked her forehead listening to her youngest daughter's words. She looked at her grandson and saw that he was smiling with a playful smile on his lips. Letting out a sigh, Riella called out to her daughter. Daenerys. Hearing her name being called, Daenerys, who had woken up early to see Caraxes, turned around startled and saw her mother looking at her with a scolding look. However, her gaze soon settled on the young man next to her mother. Nephew. Showing an excited look, Daenerys approached her family and greeted them with a joy that was simply contagious. Missandei, seeing Enar, simply bowed her head as if she had done something wrong, which, by the way, she had, since Enar didn't allow anyone to approach Caraxes without permission. Enar knew that the dragon hated any strangers approaching him. To prevent anyone from becoming dragon food, he had to stop everyone from approaching Caraxes. Looking at her unarmored nephew, Daenerys' eyes couldn't help but light up. Enar in armor gave off a majestic and regal air, but in normal, comfortable clothes he gave off an air of regal elegance, but much more approachable. Combine that with his simply beautiful appearance, and you have someone who can make your young heart beat extremely fast. While Daenerys looked at Enar, Enar also looked at Daenerys. Daenerys had the typical Targaryen features, a fine, delicate, almost supernatural beauty. She was slender and petite, with large lilac eyes and thin, pale, porcelain, almost translucent skin. She looked like a porcelain doll. Enar had to admit, his family was really beautiful to the point of making anyone wonder why God loved the Valyrians so much. "Hello, my little aunt." Stroking her hair affectionately, Enar greeted her with a gentle smile. Daenerys was really small, barely big to reach his belly. Daenerys pouted at being treated like a child, just like her mother treated her. Putting her hands on her waist, she puffed out her still-developing breasts and spoke in a tone that tried to sound as adult as possible. "Sweet nephew, we're the same age, don't treat me like a child." Enar almost couldn't help herself and started laughing. Trying his best to show a serious expression, he spoke in an apologetic tone even though he was smiling. "Forgive me, dear aunt, I didn't mean to offend you with my words." "You're forgiven, but only if you introduce me personally to Caraxes." Showing a cunning expression, Daenerys finally revealed her true intention, making Riella roll her eyes.